The Rhoden family, a large and close-knit clan from Ohio, lived in the rural area of Pike County. The patriarch, Chris Rhoden Sr., had once been married to Dana Rhoden, and together they had 3 children, Frankie, Hannah Mae, and Chris Jr. By 2016, Chris Sr. and Dana had separated but continued living on the same property on Union Hill Road. Chris, then 40 years old, worked as a laborer at the family's Big Bear Lake complex and shared a trailer with his cousin, 38-year-old Gary. Dana, 37, was a nurse's aide at a rehab center and lived in a nearby trailer with her younger children, who were 19 and 16 at the time. Also living with them was Hannah's 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. Frankie, at 20 years old, had moved in with his fiancée, Hannah Gilly, to another trailer close by. He had a 3-year-old son named Bentley from a previous relationship and a 6-month-old baby with his fiancée. Frankie spent most of his time helping his father with work at the family complex. The family circle also included Kenneth, Chris's brother, who worked in Columbus but lived only 15 minutes away from the rest of the family. On April 18, 2016, the family welcomed Hannah's newborn daughter, though her father was unknown, with rumors pointing to a relative. Still, there was no confirmation. Hannah, who had a strained relationship with Jake Wagner, Sophia's father, decided to raise her newborn within the family, juggling her work as a nurse's aide while finishing high school. The extended Rhoden family had a close bond, including Bobby Jo Manley, Dana's sister. Out of work, Bobby had been hired by Chris to care for his animals, unaware that one day, during one of his routine visits, he would stumble upon something unimaginable. At 7:53 a.m. on April 22, 2016, Bobby entered Chris and Gary's trailer, as he did every day. Immediately, he sensed something was wrong. Inside, he found the 2 men lying in a pool of blood. Horrified, he called 911, struggling to speak, and directed them to his address. Acting on instinct, Bobby rushed to another family home. He knocked, but there was no response until Bentley, the young boy, appeared. Panicked, Bobby entered the house and was met with another heart-wrenching sight. On the bed lay the bodies of Frankie and his fiancée, while their 6-month-old baby, miraculously alive but covered in blood, lay nearby. As the police made their way to the scene, a neighbor intercepted them, urging them to check 2 additional locations, suspecting more tragedy. He was right. In a 3rd trailer, they discovered the bodies of Dana, Chris Jr., and Hannah, all lifeless. The only survivor was Hannah's days-old infant. News of the massacre spread like wildfire. A cousin of the Rhodens frantically tried to confirm that Kenneth was safe. Sadly, Kenneth had also been shot. He called the authorities to report finding the final victim. By 1:26 p.m., the death toll was confirmed. Chris Sr., Dana, Frankie, Hannah, Chris Jr., Hannah Mae, Kenneth, and Gary had all been killed. The only survivors were the small children, whom the killers had left unharmed, including little Sophia, who was, by chance, at her father Jake's house that night. When investigators examined the bodies, they pieced together a chilling timeline. Chris Sr. had a defensive wound on his right arm, indicating that he was awake when the assailants entered. He had fought back but was gunned down by 9 bullets. Gary was shot 5 times. Dana had 5 wounds to her head and neck, with some shots fired even after she was already dead, showing the killer's brutality. Chris Jr. had been shot 4 times in the head while sleeping, just like Frankie. Hannah and Hannah Gilly were also executed with 2 shots each to the head. Kenneth, on the other hand, was killed with a single shot. All the victims had been shot multiple times at close range. The wounds concentrated in the same part of the body, with a total of 32 bullets fired. The killers had clearly used silencers, as no neighbors heard any gunshots. Moreover, all the victims had their hands covered with plastic bags, and some bore further marks of brutality. One of the bodies showed evidence of 9 severe injuries. It became clear that this was a meticulously planned crime, meant to eliminate the entire family. At the crime scenes, investigators found 5 different types of shell casings, proving there was more than one shooter involved. Blood from the victims was everywhere, but no DNA from the killers was found. When detectives checked security cameras at the homes, they discovered they had been disconnected, with no traces of the attacker's DNA left behind. It was evident that whoever planned this crime did so with great care. Just as the case seemed to hit a dead end, investigators uncovered a new lead. In 3 of the 4 homes, they found marijuana grow operations, with one location containing over 200 plants. Quickly, they theorized that the Rhodens may have been involved in drug trafficking, something not uncommon in Ohio. Perhaps the motive for the murders was a drug-related dispute. However, despite investigating potential connections to cartels or drug dealers, they found no conclusive evidence. Authorities considered the possibility of a family dispute over money, possibly linked to drug sales, but this line of investigation led nowhere. They also found cockfighting cages in one of the 4 trailers, but illegal cockfights didn't seem to be the motive for the killings. Investigators were about to leave, frustrated with the lack of evidence, when a key piece of testimony emerged. Dana's father told detectives that the killers had to be known to the family, as the dogs hadn't attacked them. This, combined with the fact that there were no signs of forced entry at any of the homes, narrowed the investigation's scope. The police declared that the murders were cold-blooded and that the killers were still at large and armed. They urged the remaining Rhoden family members to seek safety. 30 investigators fanned out across the state, combing every road and home, and questioning anyone connected to the family in hopes of uncovering clues. Panic spread throughout Pike County, and a local businessman named Jeff Robbie offered a $25,000 reward for information leading to the killers. Neighbors hung a sign on Christopher's barn door reading, "Do you know who killed us on April 22, 2016? By January 2017, the investigation yielded its first results, though indirectly. A Rhoden cousin was arrested for drug trafficking. However, the authorities had already determined that the amount of marijuana found at the crime scenes was not enough to suggest a cartel was involved." Months passed with little progress. Despite over 550 interviews, 1,100 tips, and the analysis of 700 pieces of evidence. On April 13, 2017, authorities delivered a grim update, admitting that they still didn't have enough evidence to make any arrests. Nevertheless, the prosecutor assured the public that there were leads they couldn't yet disclose. A year after the massacre, a memorial service was held, attended by various officials. The Pike County killings remained a topic of conversation, but 2 years after the tragedy, only the local community seemed to care. The media, the sheriff's office, and the prosecutor were noticeably absent from the second memorial service. It seemed that the largest criminal investigation in the county's history was fading into obscurity, until June, when a major break in the case occurred. The prosecutor announced for the first time that the investigation was focused on the Wagner family, who were connected to Hannah through her ex-partner. The suspects were George Wagner father, his wife Angela Wagner, both 47, and their 2 sons, George, 27, and Edward Jake, 26. The Wagners had lived just 20 miles from the crime scenes. However, by then, the family had moved to Kenai. a small town in Alaska. With them was Sophia, Hannah's surviving daughter, now under Jake's custody after her mother's death. The Wagners claimed that they had moved away because of the immense grief caused by the Rhoden family's deaths. The prosecutor called for any information about the Wagners, but the family didn't remain hidden for long. Financial struggles forced them to return to Ohio. As preparations were made to arrest them, investigators began to piece together how the relationship between the two families had turned deadly. Jake Wagner met Hannah Rhoden when he was 18, and she was just 13 during their time in high school. They went to prom together and became inseparable, which also brought their families closer. When Hannah was 15, she became pregnant with Sophia. Shortly after Sophia's birth, Jake asked Hannah to move in with him and his family, believing it would be a healthier environment for their daughter. Hannah refused, feeling it was an attempt to control her. From that point on, things deteriorated. Both Jake and Hannah wanted full custody of Sophia, and their families were locked in a bitter struggle. At one point, Jake even proposed that Hannah sign a document granting shared custody. When she refused, Jake began to threaten her, sending texts claiming that, if necessary, he would take Sophia by force. He tried to manipulate her, saying that if she truly loved their daughter, she would know Sophia belonged with him. Jake also expressed fears in these messages that the Rhoden family could harm Sophia. These tense exchanges continued for 2 years, with Hannah repeatedly refusing to live with the Wagners. In March 2015, Hannah ended her relationship with Jake, calling him abusive in texts, where she revealed he had hurt her and she was tired of being pursued. Violence seemed ingrained in the Wagner family, as George the son had obtained full custody of his child by threatening the mother with weapons. The situation escalated further when Hannah announced she was expecting another baby. Though she denied Jake was the father, he wasn't entirely sure, as they had briefly reconciled. This reignited a new custody dispute. In December 2015, Angela Wagner hacked into Hannah's social media accounts and discovered a message that infuriated the Wagner family. In the message, Hannah had told George the son's ex-mother-in-law that the Wagners would have to kill her before she gave up custody of Sophia. A week before the murders, the Wagners made one last attempt to convince Hannah to grant Jake full custody of Sophia. Again, Hannah refused. At this point, Rita, Jake's maternal grandmother, forged a document to try to make this happen legally. Tensions peaked when George the father and Christopher Sr. had a heated argument over where Sophia should live, completely fracturing the relationship between the two families. It was then that the Wagners began planning the murders. By Christmas 2016, the Wagner family held a vote. They were deciding whether to kill the Rhoden family to gain custody of Sophia. The vote was unanimous. Everyone agreed. For 8 months, the Wagner family meticulously planned the massacre. They studied the Rhoden family's routine in detail, when they went to sleep, their daily schedules, and the layout of their homes. They even researched the family's security devices. At one point, they visited the Rhoden property and fired guns into the air to see how far the sound would travel, realizing it was too loud and could expose them. George Wagner, father, decided the best option was to buy parts to create homemade silencers. Meanwhile, Angela Wagner purchased new sneakers for her husband and sons to wear on the night of the murders and instructed them to destroy the shoes afterward. She also obtained phone jammers to secretly disable the victims' devices, preventing them from calling for help. To avoid recognition, George's father acquired a truck to use during the killings. On the night of the massacre, Angela stayed home with Sophia, as it was her night to have custody. This provided them with a perfect alibi. George's father then went to Christopher's house, pretending to involve him in a fake drug deal. Unaware of what was coming, Christopher let him in. Authorities later discovered evidence linking Angela to the crime. She had purchased sneakers just weeks before the murders, and the tread matched a bloody footprint found at one of the crime scenes. They also confirmed that Angela had hacked into her ex-daughter-in-law's accounts. When investigators inspected the Wagners' electronic devices, they found numerous searches related to parental custody, highlighting their obsession with controlling Sofia. There was also evidence of financial disputes between the two families, including a $3,000 argument over a car purchase. While Angela appeared to be the mastermind, authorities were certain that Jake led the executions and that the entire Wagner family was involved. On November 13, 2018, authorities arrested 6 people. The first 4 were George Wagner father, Angela, George's son, and Jake. They were charged by a Pike County grand jury with 22 crimes, including 8 counts of aggravated murder. They all pleaded not guilty. Jake was also charged with unlawful conduct for his relationship with Hannah, as he was 20 when she was 15. That same day, 2 others were arrested for perjury and obstruction of justice. Angela's mother, Rita, 65, and George's mother, Frederica Wagner, 76. Frederica was accused of lying about purchasing bulletproof vests for her son. Neither woman was imprisoned, but Frederica was fitted with a GPS monitor. Authorities publicly revealed the motive: the long-standing custody battle over Sofia. After years of uncertainty, all that remained was to await the trial. In June 2019, records showed that Frederica had purchased the vests after the murders, leading to the charges against her being dropped. Rita wasn't as fortunate. A handwriting analysis in 2019 proved she had falsified a custody document for Sofia, leading to her entering a plea deal with the prosecution to avoid prison. The rest of the Wagners remained in jail, refusing to cooperate. They expressed sadness over the deaths of the Rhoden family and claimed they wanted the real killers to be brought to justice. For a time, it seemed the case might never close, leaving the people of Ohio unsettled. Then, 2 years later, something unexpected happened. On April 22, 2021, the 5th anniversary of the massacre, Jake Wagner struck a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for sparing his family from the death penalty, Jake confessed to personally killing 5 of the 8 victims and pleaded guilty to 23 criminal charges. 8 were for aggravated murder, while the others included conspiracy, aggravated robbery, tampering with evidence, and unlawful conduct with a minor. Jake admitted that he felt he had to kill Hannah to gain custody of Sofia, and once he made that decision, he believed he had to eliminate the rest of the Rhoden family to avoid retaliation. He expressed deep remorse for his actions. Jake was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. After his trial, he agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in their cases against his parents and brother. Thanks to his testimony, investigators located the truck George the son had purchased specifically for the crime, as well as 3 firearms the Wagners had attempted to dismantle and burn. These weapons had been buried in concrete behind the family's pond. A specialist was able to reconstruct the fragments, confirming that the shell casings matched those found at the Rhoden homes. On September 10, 2021, Angela Wagner pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, robbery, and tampering with evidence. In exchange for her testimony against the remaining accused, the prosecution dropped the aggravated murder charges. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Only George father and George son were left to face trial. On August 28, 2022, George Wagner's son's trial began. The prosecutor called George's ex-partner to testify, revealing she had distanced herself from the family out of fear for her life. The prosecution argued that George had been complicit in planning, executing, and covering up the murders. George, however, denied having any knowledge of the crimes before or after they occurred, stating that if his family had asked him to participate, he would never have agreed. After 3 months, George was found guilty on all 22 counts, including 8 counts of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 111 years for firearms charges. George's father still awaits his trial. If convicted on the same 22 charges, he will face the same fate as his son. Despite the convictions, he continues to claim his innocence. The surviving children were placed in the care of distant relatives. For privacy reasons, their exact whereabouts are undisclosed, but it is known that they are safe and happy. The Wagner family's goal had been to gain custody of Sophia, claiming they could care for her better. Instead, they deprived her of her mother, her uncles, and her grandparents. The hope now is that she grows up far from her father's family, in an environment where violence is never seen as a solution. Neibaldo Villegas worked as a computers teacher in the Valparaiso region of Chile. Everyone who knew him said he was a kind man who loved to help. He had many friends, both within and outside his work environment, and enjoyed socializing, often meeting up with relatives and friends. However, he never neglected his job. In 2009, when Neibaldo was 41, he met Johanna Hernandez, a 23-year-old woman studying at the same university where he taught. Johanna was going through a tough time, having just ended a relationship with her boyfriend since she was 15, with whom she had 2 children. Neibaldo was like a beacon of light for her. In December of that year, they started a relationship, and both their lives improved. Neibaldo and his family welcomed Johanna's children as if they were their own. After getting married, Neibaldo built a house with his own hands for them to live together and be happy. Their greatest joy came when Johanna gave birth to a daughter, their first child together. For 8 years, the relationship faced no major problems, and Neibaldo's professional life continued to prosper. Motivated by him, Johanna continued her nursing technician studies. When they did argue, Neibaldo preferred to go running, and upon returning, after both had time to reflect, they would talk in their bedroom and resolve their differences. But good things don't last forever. In 2018, their arguments became constant. Johanna started reacting differently to problems, becoming physically and emotionally violent. Neibaldo tried his usual approach of walking away and returning when she was ready to talk, but Johanna had changed. Her mood would shift rapidly, leaving Neibaldo with no time to leave. Things escalated to the point where Johanna, during an argument, started throwing things around and declared the relationship over. Neibaldo agreed to end the relationship but was concerned about her reactions. He went to the police station and filed a domestic violence report, fearing for his daughter's safety. Although the police dismissed the complaint, Johanna took it seriously, and a big dispute ensued over the house and custody of their daughter. Due to Johanna's violent outbursts, Neibaldo sought full custody. The family completely broke down, stopped living together, and Neibaldo filed for divorce, only seeing each other through lawyers. Eventually, the courts ruled for shared custody, which Johanna did not accept well. She began harassing Neibaldo, demanding the house he had painstakingly built. On one occasion, she showed up at the university parking lot and threw stones at his car. Neibaldo maintained his composure, not wanting to worsen the situation or make his daughter uncomfortable, and eagerly awaited the finalization of their divorce for a change. August 10, 2018, was an important date for Neibaldo, his 50th birthday. He spent most of the day with his daughter, but went to his parents' house in the evening. He left his daughter with them as he was dining with friends and promised to return soon to put her to bed. The grandparents were happy to take care of her and spent quality time with her for several hours. However, when bedtime came, Neibaldo didn't show up. They tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail, which was unusual for Neibaldo, who was always attentive when his daughter wasn't with him. They decided to go to their son's house. On arrival, they noticed something suspicious. Neibaldo's car was parked in front. They entered the house and saw the house keys on a table, along with the jacket their son had been wearing when he left his daughter before dinner. However, what struck them most was a shattered glass on the floor. They hurried upstairs to Neibaldo's bedroom, fearing what they suspected. Their son was nowhere to be found, and their alarm grew. That same night, Neibaldo's parents went to the police station to file a missing person report. The search operation began immediately, involving friends, university acquaintances, and even neighbors, but no one knew where Neibaldo was. When Johanna was interrogated, she stated they hadn't seen each other for a long time due to their separation and appeared extremely distressed about his disappearance. Days later, Johanna showed up at Neibaldo's house, which his brother was staying at, carrying a large bag. She declared she would stay as long as she wanted, claiming it was her house too since they were still legally married. This seemed odd to the brother, knowing the couple had ended on very bad terms. To the Villegas family's surprise, Johanna became increasingly involved in the search for Neibaldo, posting on Facebook and giving interviews where she tearfully pleaded for her estranged partner's return. For 5 days, the country was gripped by the search for the missing teacher until a boat brought an answer. On August 15 of that year, workers at the pier near Valparaiso, while performing their duties, spotted something alarming in the water. A human torso without limbs was floating in the calm sea. They immediately alerted the police. Once the authorities and forensic experts arrived, they determined it was a man between 30 and 50 years old. While they couldn't establish the identity yet, everyone thought the same. It had to be the missing professor, whose face had been all over the television for the past 5 days. On August 20, the Prosecution and Homicide Brigade of the Investigative Police confirmed that the torso belonged to none other than Neibaldo. The discovery made a strong statement. Neibaldo was a peaceful man, got along with everyone, and had never been involved in anything illegal. The perpetrator had to be someone from his close circle. As detectives began their investigation, Johanna was the first of Neibaldo's relatives to give a television interview, crying inconsolably, urging the capture of the culprit. Unbeknownst to her, she was exposing herself. On the day the body was found, 2 men went to the police station, wanting to speak to detectives about what they had seen on the day Neibaldo disappeared. On the early morning of August 11, the 2 individuals headed to the beach, intending to go on a fishing trip. Although unfamiliar with the area, they were excited about the expedition. However, their enthusiasm waned when they got lost at sea in the dark. Just as they were losing hope, they saw distant orange flames. They approached the shore with their boat and noticed a bonfire. A man was trying to keep the flames alive, using branches, cloths, and other objects they couldn't identify. The fisherman approached to ask for directions, thinking he might be lost like them. They tried to engage in casual conversation, but the man barely responded, only telling them it wasn't a good area for fishing before turning his attention back to the fire. The fishermen found the situation odd, especially when they noticed a blue car parked a few meters from the bonfire, with a woman inside smoking frantically. The situation seemed highly suspicious, but with nowhere else to go, the fishermen decided to stay overnight for shelter from the cold. At dawn, The woman got out of the car and approached the man by the fire. They appeared unaware of the fisherman's presence, shared a kiss, and gave one last look at the bonfire before driving away without a word. Before leaving, the fisherman took a closer look at the fire and noticed a sharp knife among the flames. Although it seemed strange, they preferred not to investigate further. They didn't think about that night again until days later when a human torso was found floating near where they had been, realizing they had accidentally witnessed a terrible crime. After hearing the fisherman's story, the police went to the beach. It was a secluded area, so the remains of the bonfire were still there. They discovered that the mysterious man wasn't just burning branches and cloths, but also human remains. Forensic experts confirmed these were the remaining limbs of Neibaldo. But the fisherman provided another crucial piece of information. They described the woman smoking in the blue car as dark-haired, with long, straight hair of a darker complexion and around 30 years old. The same woman seen crying on television. From that moment, the police began investigating Johanna as the primary suspect in Neibaldo's murder. The only question was the identity of the man with her. Days later, the police discovered that Neibaldo's credit card had been used to withdraw 35,000 pesos from an ATM at a gas station on the morning of August 11. Security cameras showed a man in black making the transaction. The victim's family recognized him as Johanna's current partner, Francisco Silva. Additionally, shortly after the body's identification, Johanna went to a real estate agency to inquire about the property registered to Neibaldo, which they had fought over countless times, and where she had moved after his disappearance. There was no doubt that both Johanna and Silva were guilty of the crime. Both suspects gave their testimony at the oral criminal court. They admitted to being part of the crime, but blamed each other for its execution. Johanna was the first to give her version. She said her relationship with Silva was extremely complicated. Since they started dating, he had been manipulative, controlling what she wore, who she associated with, and even encouraged her to sign a prenuptial agreement. Silva's violence was not only reflected in his relationship with Johanna, but also in his strong feelings towards Neibaldo, seemingly driven by jealousy. After Neibaldo tried to gain full custody of the daughter he shared with Johanna, she came home crying. This intensified Silva's hatred, who said he would make Neibaldo disappear someday. The week before, on August 10, 2018, Silva arrived at Johanna's house with a jar containing a blue powder, instructing her not to ask questions and indicating he would have orders for her during the week. Accustomed to obeying Silva, Johanna agreed. On the Friday of Neibaldo's birthday, Francisco Silva contacted Johanna, instructing her to meet him to celebrate, and detailed the steps to follow. That night, Johanna arrived at the house of Neibaldo. He greeted her, hoping for reconciliation. Johanna brought sushi and a drink for dinner, but she omitted a crucial detail. The drink was laced with clonazepam. 10 minutes after sitting down to eat, Neibaldo began to doze off. Once he was completely unconscious, Johanna took him to his bed, snapped 2 photos, and sent them to Silva, completing her part of the plan. Silva then entered the house, changed into black clothing, and headed to the room where Neibaldo was carrying a knife. Minutes later, he came downstairs and informed Johanna that he had mutilated Neibaldo. He gave her gloves to clean the blood in the room and a trash bag for the limbs. While disposing of the body, Silva ominously warned Johanna that no matter what happened, she must not accuse him, or he would ensure she was seen as the true perpetrator. They then drove to the beach, where they'd burned the limbs and clothing in a bonfire and tossed the torso into the sea. However, Silva's version was somewhat different. He not only denied Johanna's accusations, but also portrayed her as a violent person, prone to destructive outbursts when angry. According to him, Johanna used her tantrums and intimacy to manipulate him. He mentioned the prenuptial contract as a joke, inside gag after watching the movie 50 Shades, which she exploited to her advantage. The worst crisis came when Neibaldo wanted full custody of their daughter. Johanna swore she'd never forgive him and was ready to murder him. Seeing how upset Johanna was, Silva felt it was his duty as a man to do something about it and decided to do whatever she asked. Days later, Johanna requested he buy 30 clomazepam pills and grind them, which he did. The main difference in Silva's story was that on Friday, August 10, they were to follow their usual routine of having a barbecue, drinking, and sleeping in his car at the beach. However, when he picked Johanna up from her mother's house, he learned she had a different plan. She said they needed to stop by Neibaldo's to discuss their daughter. Once there, Johanna asked Silva to wait at a nearby place and wait for her instructions. He agreed. At 1 a.m., Silva woke to 3 WhatsApp messages from Johanna, 2 photos of an unconscious Neibaldo in bed, and a 3rd message asking him to come get her. Arriving at the house, Johanna was frantic, explaining she had drugged Neibaldo with clomazepam before attacking him with a knife. The problem was that while she was stabbing him, Neibaldo woke up, and his pleas could be heard from the bedroom. Johanna instructed Silva to finish the murder, handing him a sharp knife. Silva went upstairs and fatally stabbed Neibaldo in the thoracic area. Immediately after, Johanna asked Silva to help her dismember the body to make it easier to hide. The rest of the story, involving the movement and concealment of different body parts, was exactly the same in both their accounts, seemingly the only aspect they both wanted to take responsibility for. The methods of the murder and the locations where the body parts were found matched in both stories. What differed was the principal perpetrator, as each one aimed to receive a lesser sentence. They also agreed in their statement that the murder was not premeditated. However, the prosecutors argued that the crime seemed meticulously planned, given how it was executed. Technology experts located both of their cell phones at Neibaldo's house at the time of his death, and both had photos of the unconscious man in bed, implicating Johanna and Silva equally in the eyes of justice. The prosecutor stated that Johanna was the material author of the crime. Francisco Silva was convicted as the material author of qualified homicide. Both had the aggravating factor of treachery, which occurs when the perpetrator uses means or ways to eliminate all the victim's possibilities of defense. In Neibaldo's case, the means was the substance that rendered him unconscious. On May 16, 2019, the criminal court informed the sentence for both defendants. Receiving the maximum possible penalty, Johanna was sentenced to life imprisonment, meaning she must serve 40 years before being eligible for penitentiary benefits. Silva was sentenced to simple life imprisonment, meaning he could opt for penitentiary benefits after 20 years. Johanna's defense requested a reclassification of the sentence, arguing she had collaborated with the investigation. They also sought to annul the aggravating factor of treachery, claiming there was no proof of clomazepam administration. Silva's lawyer also tried to reduce the sentence by claiming active participation in the investigation. Fortunately for the victim's family, both requests were denied. About 100 people gathered outside the court, celebrating with intense banners, but while citizens unrelated to the crime celebrated, the families involved in the case were left shattered. The Villegas family's lawyer stated that while they were satisfied with the sentence, Neibaldo's siblings would seek an update in the law, advocating for harsher penalties in dismemberment cases. Without the complete body of the victim, they couldn't give a dignified burial. Johanna's father also spoke about the crime, saying she had always been manipulative and violent, but worsened after meeting Francisco Silva. He agreed with her sentence and said he would never forgive her. In other interviews, he recalled Neibaldo's good character and expressed that he would always consider him part of the family, often visiting his grave with flowers. After the trial, Johanna and Silva were transferred to a penitentiary complex, where their troubles did not end. In prison, Johanna gained a high status for having ended her husband's life, instilling fear in most of the other inmates. Silva, on the other hand, was completely isolated, only going out to the yard when other inmates were not there. His situation only worsened over time. He went on a hunger strike for several days and wrote a letter to the National Human Rights Institute and the Court of Appeals, requesting a reduction in his sentence. When his plans did not work, Silva tried to contact Johanna, telling her he had spoken with a lawyer and was trying to reopen the case. His plan was for Johanna to claim she was the murderer so he would be seen as an accomplice. According to him, this would frame the crime as a momentary act of violence and might reduce their sentences for lack of premeditation. Johanna refused outright. Enraged, Francisco threatened her, claiming he had contacts who could harm her at any time. Eventually, Johanna filed a complaint for murder threats with the public ministry, which could play in her favor as it portrayed Silva as manipulative and conspiratorial, just as she had described him in her version of the events. As a result, the only measures taken against Silva were the confiscation of his cell phone and his transfer to a high-security cell. He was also barred from receiving family visits. While the murderers continue their lives in prison, Neibaldo's family is still fighting for him to rest in peace. They submitted a request to amend the penal code. The proposal, named Neibaldo's Law, aimed to add a clause to more rigorously penalize dismemberment or damage to a corpse, increasing the sentence for perpetrators by 3 to 5 years. If enacted, this law would not be retroactive and would not change the sentences for Neibaldo's murderers, but it would apply to future cases. The Villegas family might never be able to give Neibaldo a dignified burial, but they could prevent other families from suffering the same pain. In March 2022, the law was unanimously approved by the Senate and is currently being debated in the Chamber of Deputies. If it passes, it will only need the executive's approval to be officially promulgated. The Villegas siblings continue to carry this fight on their shoulders. Nothing will bring Neibaldo back, but they are doing everything possible to make the world a fairer place. On the afternoon of March 24, 2015, a 30-year-old man named Aaron Quinn reported that his girlfriend, Denise Huskins, had been kidnapped from their bedroom the previous night. Local authorities responded quickly, heading straight to the apartment where the incident took place. Upon arrival, the officers encountered a puzzling crime scene. The screen near the back door had been slashed with a knife, and the door lock appeared to have been tampered with, suggesting a forced entry. The bedroom on the second floor was in complete disarray, with blankets and sheets piled haphazardly on the bed. On the floor, they found unusual items: swim goggles taped shut and an empty bottle of cough syrup. But what stood out most was a square section of the bedroom floor outlined with red tape, within which a chair had been placed, seemingly positioned to face something. Oddly enough, a camera had been set up directly in front of the chair, yet it was unplugged and not connected to the internet, serving no apparent purpose other than decoration. No fingerprints or other DNA evidence were found at the scene, and no signs of a struggle were visible. When questioned, the neighbors claimed they hadn't heard any screams or disturbances the night of the incident, which added to the overall mystery. But Aaron's version of events made things even stranger. He recounted how he had woken up suddenly in the middle of the night to the glare of a flashlight. Dazed and confused, he noticed a red dot dancing across his chest, something that immediately reminded him of the laser sights used on firearms. Filled with fear, his instinct was to protect Denise, but before he could act, A masked man pointed a gun at his head and ordered him to bind his girlfriend's hands and feet with zip ties provided by the intruder. After Aaron complied, the man tied him up as well. The intruder then covered their eyes with the swim goggles, which were sealed shut with tape, effectively blinding them. Aaron said they were forced to hand over their bank cards, PIN numbers, social security numbers, and even their phones. The kidnapper then used their phones to text their bosses, explaining that they wouldn't be able to come to work due to feeling unwell. Things took a darker turn when the intruder made both Aaron and Denise drink an entire bottle of medicine, presumably the cough syrup found at the scene. The sedative effects of the medicine soon knocked them out. Aaron said that after he lost consciousness, he was dragged to a chair positioned within the red tape square, and when he awoke, the goggles were removed. The intruder told him not to leave the square, warning that if he did, his girlfriend's life would be in immediate danger. Pointing to the unplugged camera, the kidnapper claimed it was monitoring his every move. To further manipulate the situation, he placed headphones on Aaron's head and played soothing music, a jarring contrast to the tense situation. After issuing his final threats, the kidnapper took Denise downstairs and vanished without a trace. Aaron, still disoriented from the drugs, remained in the square for hours, eventually succumbing to exhaustion and falling asleep. It wasn't until the following afternoon that he woke up, cut the zip ties binding him, and finally called the police. The officers who interviewed Aaron were left baffled by his bizarre story of abduction. Every detail seemed to defy logic, making them question the truth behind his claims. Drawing a square on the floor and forcing him to stay inside it? It felt like the kidnapper had seen too many Western movies and imagined Aaron was someone important. And Aaron had sat there for more than 10 hours without moving. The officers were skeptical. The biggest question on their minds was the motive. Why would the kidnapper go to such lengths to abduct someone? As Aaron struggled to convince the police that his story was real, a message suddenly appeared on his phone. It was from the kidnapper demanding a ransom. "See, I'm not lying," Aaron insisted. But the ransom amount, $12,000, was oddly specific. Whether it was a lot or not, the officers found it strange that the kidnapper would request such an exact figure. This made the police suspicious, wondering if Aaron could be involved in some way. Maybe he had harmed his girlfriend and was now playing the victim to deflect suspicion. Aaron strongly denied this, insisting that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. "How could I have sent a message to myself right in front of you?" he asked. But the experienced detectives weren't buying it. They knew about ways to schedule texts to be sent later. For the next several hours, the interrogation continued. Aaron was hooked up to a lie detector, questioned repeatedly, and even had lawyers consulted, but nothing conclusive came from it. Meanwhile, something else odd happened. The local newspaper received a voicemail from a woman claiming to be the missing Denise. She said she had been kidnapped but was still alive. To prove her identity, she mentioned her favorite band from her first concert and the name of her high school boyfriend. However, her voice was calm and steady, as if she were talking about someone else's situation, not her own. This made the police even more suspicious. Who could stay so composed while supposedly being held captive? The police then began interviewing the couple's colleagues and friends. What they uncovered was a scandal. It turned out Aaron and Denise were both physical therapists at the same local hospital. Even more shocking, Aaron's ex-fiancée, Andrea, also worked there. Aaron and Andrea had been engaged, planning a wedding, but things fell apart when Andrea cheated on him. Though they had broken up, the two still worked together and saw each other regularly. Even after Aaron started dating Denise, it seemed he hadn't completely cut ties with Andrea. Strangely, Aaron recalled that during the kidnapping, the masked man had repeatedly asked him for names, and at one point, even called him Andrea. Could it be that the kidnapper had intended to target Aaron's ex-fiancée, but accidentally took the wrong person? Despite this new information, the police remained convinced that there was no real kidnapper, just a love triangle gone wrong. They theorized that one or more people might have concocted this whole scheme to eliminate a romantic rival or add excitement to their lives. Though they continued with formal investigations, deploying search dogs and distributing flyers, their focus shifted increasingly to Aaron as a suspect. Aaron, clinging to his story, continued to insist on his innocence, but after hours of questioning, the police began to lose patience. Legally, they could hold him for 48 hours before charging him, so they decided to wait. Aaron wasn't put in a prison uniform, but he was given minimal food and water and confined to a small cell under constant pressure. Then came shocking news. Denise had been found alive. Media reports stated that she had been discovered in Huntington Beach, over 400 miles away from where the kidnapping was reported. While this might have seemed like a stroke of luck, Denise's sudden reappearance only made Aaron look more suspicious. Typically, kidnappers release their victims in remote areas, far from civilization, to create a delay before the police can reach them. But in this case, the kidnapper had dropped Denise off in an alley near her parents' house. When the police found her, Denise's wallet, cash, and credit cards were all untouched, which contradicted Aaron's claim that the abduction had been financially motivated. More importantly, no ransom had ever been paid, so why had the kidnapper released her? Denise told police that, after being taken, her eyes were covered, and she was brought to a small, quiet house where the windows had been completely covered with cardboard. She said the kidnapper, who wore a black hoodie, assaulted her inside the house. They stayed there for almost 2 days before the kidnapper told her to drink cough syrup, blindfolded her with the taped-up goggles again, and drove her away. Disoriented by fear and the effects of the medication, Denise couldn't tell how long they had been driving, but after being told to count to 20 and then open her eyes, she found herself near her parents' home. The police found Denise's story even more unbelievable than Aaron's. They required her to undergo a medical examination, particularly focusing on evidence related to the alleged assault. Surprisingly, her physical exam revealed no signs of injury, and there were no traces of male DNA on or inside her body. Denise explained this by saying that during the assault, the kidnapper's genitals had felt odd, as though they weren't real, possibly a toy. This led police to suspect that the kidnapper might not have been a man at all. The police began to suspect that Denise might have voluntarily left home and fabricated the entire story to avoid the consequences of her actions. How could a case so ridiculous be real? A kidnapper who didn't want money, didn't want the person, and simply held her for 2 days as if playing the role of a modern-day Good Samaritan. Denise refused to take the lie detector test the police insisted on. She angrily declared, "I'm the victim here. Instead of finding my kidnapper, why are you harassing me?" Her outburst only fueled the officer's suspicion. After all, why would a victim resist an investigation unless there was something to hide? Not long after, the police held a press conference. The chief, clearly annoyed, told reporters that the entire case had been a hoax. He accused the couple of wasting police resources and planning an elaborate kidnapping scheme for attention. Both Aaron and Denise were formally charged with fraud and public resource misuse. Suddenly, the once respected therapists found themselves branded as notorious scammers. Their jobs were suspended, and their reputations were tarnished. The local community turned against them, even comparing their story to the plot of a recent blockbuster movie. But the story didn't end there. 8 days after the couple's charges were filed, a small-town newspaper received a mysterious email. The sender, claiming to be the real kidnapper, mocked the police for being fooled so easily and vowed to continue targeting others. The email contained 2 photographs, one of a toy gun with a laser pointer taped to it, and another showing the corner of a room with windows sealed by cardboard. These specific details were never made public and were known only to the victims and the investigators handling the case. With years of experience in journalism, the newspaper editor noticed that the email was written with an unusually precise legal tone, different from what you'd expect from an average person or even 2 medical professionals. Yet, the police refused to acknowledge the authenticity of the email, suspecting it to be a distraction crafted by the couple. They argued that since the couple had hired lawyers, it wouldn't be impossible for someone to write the email for them. 3 months passed, and the case of the supposed fake kidnapping and the real fraud remained entangled in legal proceedings. Then, less than 80 miles from where Denise had allegedly been abducted, there was a home invasion and attempted kidnapping. When police arrived at the scene to gather evidence, they discovered something eerily familiar: swimming goggles sealed with duct tape. Due to the high-profile nature of the earlier case, the police initially thought it could be a copycat criminal, using the same method to blindfold the victims. However, after speaking with the victims' families, they were stunned to discover striking similarities between the 2 cases. This time, it was a family of 3, the parents in one room and their 14-year-old daughter in the adjoining bedroom. The father was awakened in the middle of the night by a flashlight beam, just like in the previous case, and saw the same red laser dot. A tall man in a black hood pointed a gun at the father's head and demanded that he tie his wife's hands and feet with zip ties. Every step mirrored the earlier incident, but with one critical difference: the father did not comply. Instead, he fought back fiercely, using a bedside lamp to strike the intruder. Taking advantage of the situation, the mother quickly hid in the bathroom. The father then yelled to his wife to grab a gun from the bathroom, though there was no gun in the house, nor had either of them ever used one. The bluff worked, scaring the intruder, who fled the house. The father chased the man outside, where he saw him drive off in a white car. It was only then that the couple realized their daughter had been tied up in her room, her hands and feet bound, and her eyes covered. It seemed the intruder's plan had been to incapacitate the parents first, then abduct the daughter. Fortunately, the parents' brave actions thwarted what could have been a devastating outcome. Although photos of the family were never released, reports mentioned that the father was of Asian descent. Due to the intruder's hurried escape, the crime scene was not as carefully cleaned as it had been when Denise was kidnapped. The police found DNA from the attacker on the bedside lamp, as well as a suspicious Samsung phone near the door. The phone was registered to a 38-year-old Californian man named Matthew Muller. Additionally, the police managed to recover deleted text messages and photos from the phone, including the $12,000 ransom demand sent to Denise's boyfriend. Using the location data from when the ransom message was sent, the police tracked down a vacation cabin owned by Muller. They immediately went there and found a white car parked outside, matching the description given by the Asian father in the second case. Without hesitation, they entered the property and found Matthew calmly sitting in the living room, hands raised, saying, "You finally found me." He offered no resistance and cooperated fully during his arrest. Inside the vacation cabin, police discovered a room where the windows were sealed with cardboard, perfectly matching the photos from the leaked email and Denise's description. They also found a replica gun, duct-taped swimming goggles, zip ties, and cough syrup mixed with sedatives. In Matthew's car, they uncovered a crucial piece of evidence, a blonde hair strand tangled in one of the zip ties. And whose blonde hair was it? None other than that of Denise. What's more, the data from Matthew's car showed that he had been near Denise's apartment on the night of March 24th and near her parents' home 2 days later, exactly coinciding with the times of her kidnapping and release. All the evidence pointed to the fact that Denise and her boyfriend had been telling the truth the entire time. However, when the police showed Matthew's photo to the couple for identification, they both claimed they had never seen him before and didn't display any hostility toward him. They were completely bewildered as to how they had become involved in this mess. So the big question remained, why did Matthew commit these heinous acts? The key to understanding his motive lay in Matthew's background. Police investigations revealed that Matthew came from a wealthy family. His father owned a large accounting firm in California, ensuring Matthew had been financially secure since birth. Despite his wealth, Matthew didn't squander his fortune. After finishing high school, he enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, becoming a mechanic. His superiors praised his intelligence and diligence during his service. After leaving the military, Matthew was accepted into Harvard Law School, graduating with honors and becoming a licensed attorney. This explained why the newspaper editor had recognized the sophisticated language in the extortion letter. In 2012, a female intern at the law firm where Matthew worked accused him of sexual harassment. The case dragged on for over a year before Matthew settled privately, paying the woman a substantial sum. However, during the proceedings, the intern's testimony somehow leaked. She described Matthew as having deviant desires but lacking the physical ability to act on them, requiring tools to harass women. This revelation caused Matthew's reputation to plummet. His wife of 2 years also took advantage of the situation and divorced him. Afterward, Matthew left the firm and didn't renew his law license, effectively ending his legal career. He later tried his hand at sales but was soon fired for poor performance. The shadow of the harassment lawsuit haunted him, derailing his life. Though Matthew could have lived comfortably without working, he blamed the intern for ruining his career. His anger first targeted his ex-wife, but soon extended to all women. He saw the world as unfairly biased toward women, with both the legal system and public opinion siding against men. This sense of injustice fueled his desire for revenge, to prove that assumptions could be wrong. In the past 2 years, there had been over 30 reported home invasions in the San Francisco Bay Area, but nearly all the women who reported the incidents were dismissed as mentally unstable. Only 2 cases were filed, quickly buried among countless others. Matthew's appetite for humiliation grew, and targeting women alone no longer excited him. He found greater pleasure in humiliating men in front of their partners, not just causing harm but ensuring that they were ruined forever. If not for the brave actions of the Asian family who fought back, who knows how far Matthew's twisted plan would have escalated. After Matthew's arrest, his wealthy parents spared no expense in trying to absolve him, hiring top defense attorneys and even a renowned psychologist to argue that Matthew had severe mental health issues and possibly a split personality. But in the face of all these efforts, Matthew made a sudden decision. He chose to plead guilty to all charges. In his mind, he had achieved his goal. He had shattered people's trust in the police, the judicial system, and even women. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison for multiple offenses. As for Denise and her boyfriend, the fraud charges against them were officially dropped 2 days after Matthew's arrest. The city's police department issued a formal apology, and details of the case were finally released, clearing up the confusion. It turned out the entire narrative about a love triangle had been pure speculation by the media. In 2018, Following a lengthy civil suit, the couple and the police department reached a settlement. They were awarded $2.5 million in damages for the emotional and reputational harm they had suffered due to the police's mishandling of the case. Fortunately, after enduring so much hardship, the couple married in September 2018. A year later, they welcomed their first daughter, followed by another girl in 2022. Now, the family of 4 enjoys a peaceful life in a small town, having moved past the dark chapter of their lives. Natalie Holloway was born on October 21, 1986 in Clinton, Mississippi. Later, she moved to Mountain Brook, Alabama. As the eldest of 2 siblings with a younger brother named Matthew, Natalie was raised in a loving and close-knit family. Her parents, Beth and David, were high school sweethearts who married in the 1980s but separated in 1993 after 13 years of marriage. Despite the divorce, David remained actively involved in his children's lives. In 2000, Beth remarried George "Jug" Twitty, a businessman from Alabama, and the family moved to Mountain Brook. Natalie thrived in this supportive environment, excelling academically and participating in various extracurricular activities. She was excited to celebrate her high school graduation with a trip before starting her pre-med studies at the University of Alabama, where she had earned a full scholarship. Although her parents were initially hesitant, they ultimately supported her decision to take the trip, unaware of the tragic events that would soon unfold. Natalie Holloway was eager to make the most of her trip to Aruba and thrilled about the adventure. On May 26, 2005, she, along with 125 of her Mountain Brook High School classmates and 7 chaperones, arrived on the Caribbean island. The group stayed at the Holiday Inn, and soon after arriving, the students were allowed to explore the island independently. Natalie and her friends spent the next few days sunbathing, snorkeling, and enjoying the local nightlife. It was her first time experiencing legal drinking, which she embraced. The group frequently visited popular spots like the nightclub Carlos and Charlie's and the Excelsior Casino, both near their hotel. On May 29, 2005, the last day of their trip, Natalie and her friends were at the casino near a blackjack table when they encountered a Dutch tourist named Joran van der Sloot. Joran, a visiting student from the Netherlands, introduced himself to Natalie, and they quickly hit it off. His group planned to head to Carlos and Charlie's, and they invited Joran to join them. Just before closing time, Joran arrived at the club and offered Natalie some drinks at the back bar, which she accepted. Unbeknownst to her, one of the drinks had been spiked with a substance known as Liquid X, a colorless, odorless drug that requires only a few drops to render the victim disoriented and unable to remember what happens next. As the drug began to take effect, Natalie felt increasingly ill. Joran concocted a story about a shark sighting near the lighthouse and convinced Natalie to come with him to the beach. He led her to a silver gray Honda parked outside the club, where his friend Deepak was driving, and his brother Satish sat in the front seat. Natalie's friends saw her leave with the stranger, but they did not intervene. This would be the last time anyone would see Natalie Holloway. By the morning of May 30th, 2005, when the Mountain Brook students were preparing to board their flight home, Natalie was missing. Beth received a devastating call that her daughter hadn't shown up for the flight. In a panic, Beth boarded a private jet owned by a friend and arrived in Aruba within 12 hours. She immediately went to the local police station to report Natalie's disappearance, urging them to begin an investigation. Beth insisted on reviewing security footage from the casino with the manager, which revealed that Natalie had left the club with Joran. Investigations uncovered that Joran was a known regular at Aruba's casinos, involved in gambling, drug use, and other questionable activities. He lived in a guest house on his family's property and had a reputation for targeting women on their last night in Aruba, isolating them from their friends, drugging them, and assaulting them at his guest house. Despite numerous allegations of aggravated assault, Joran had never faced consequences, as his well-crafted plans left little evidence. Around 3 a.m. the next day, Beth convinced the police to take her to the Van der Sloot residence. There, she met Joran's father, Paul van der Sloot, who immediately denied any connection between his son and the case. Joran, along with Deepak and Sadish, joined the conversation. When Beth confronted them, Joran claimed they had only gone for a few drinks and dropped Natalie off at her hotel. Paul, a local judicial official, intervened, advising his son to stop engaging with Beth, using his position to protect Joran and buy time to eliminate any evidence. The police offered minimal assistance, leaving Beth no choice but to return to the station. Hotel security footage later disproved Joran's claims, showing no sign of Natalie being dropped off. By this point, Natalie's father, David, had arrived in Aruba to join the search. Despite 48 hours passing since Natalie's disappearance, the police hesitated to consider Joran a suspect, repeatedly assuring the family that Natalie would soon be found. As the public pressure mounted, investigators finally questioned Joran and the Kalpoe brothers. Initially, Joran and the brothers claimed they had taken Natalie to the California lighthouse to watch sharks before dropping her off at the hotel around 2 a.m. on May 30, 2005. However, discrepancies in their stories led to the eventual arrest of the three suspects as the search for Natalie continued without yielding significant clues. On June 26th, Sadish Kalpoe admitted to lying to the police during his initial questioning. He later changed his statement, claiming that he and Deepak had dropped off Joran and Natalie at the hotel, which was the last time they saw her. Meanwhile, a gardener from the Aruba Racket Club provided a sworn statement, claiming to have seen the three men in a car near the club around 2 a.m., contradicting the Kalpoe brothers' earlier assertion that they were already home by that time. As the case continued to unravel with conflicting testimonies and no sign of Natalie, the Aruba Police Department, Dutch Marines, FBI agents, and thousands of local volunteers searched every corner of the area, though only on land. Finally, on June 25th, a group of volunteers deployed divers and sonar equipment in hopes of finding any evidence. 6 weeks after Natalie's disappearance, her family offered a $200,000 reward for her safe return and $100,000 for any information leading to the case's resolution. By the end of July, the reward was raised to $1 million for Natalie's safe return. Beth stayed in Aruba for 2 full months, leaving just a week before the Kalpoe brothers, who had previously been released, were rearrested on August 26th. The brothers, along with Joran, were released again on September 3. In late August, divers from the Aruban search team and the Rescue Foundation returned to the search after receiving a tip about a radar machine detecting human bones about a mile off the coast, but they found nothing. In March 2006, 10 months after Natalie's disappearance, Aruban authorities reported that witnesses had stated the teenager had been drinking heavily that night and had cocaine in her possession, though no one claimed to have seen her using it. Authorities believe that Natalie might have entered a state of shock, experiencing a severe reaction due to the combination of alcohol and possibly other drugs, either taken voluntarily or administered to her. This could have caused her to collapse, leading search teams to believe she had died. Consequently, Efforts were focused on the beach where Joran claimed to have last seen her and a nearby salt lagoon, where they searched for forensic evidence. Throughout the investigation, Joran's story kept changing. He seemed intrigued by the media attention and used it to his advantage, frequently contacting news outlets with claims of new evidence, often attempting to extort money for fabricated leads. Joran van der Sloot was born on August 6, 1987, in Arnhem, Netherlands. He was known as an honor student and a tennis star at the International School of Aruba. His father, a lawyer, was in the process of becoming a judge at the time of Natalie's disappearance. One of Natalie's close friends remembered her first impression of Joran, noting his height and thinking it was odd that he was hanging out with their group. Despite her initial observation, she did not immediately suspect him. Joran was quickly identified by a Holiday Inn employee as a regular who often targeted young female tourists. He spent 3 months in jail but was released when a judge ruled that there was insufficient evidence to hold him. By the end of 2007, he and the Kalpoe brothers were arrested again, but once more, nothing came of it, and they were released. Joran later traveled freely across the world, spending time in Thailand and engaging in suspicious activities, though he managed to evade capture. He frequently discussed the case, seemingly relishing the notoriety it brought him. His temper was unpredictable. During an interview with Dutch crime reporter in January 2008, Joran threw a glass of wine at Peter when questioned about the credibility of his claims. In November 2008, CNN reported that Aruban authorities had 2 new leads to investigate. One came from a witness who claimed to have seen Paulus van der Sloot on the night of May 29, 2005. He told police that while Paulus claimed to have been sleeping at home by 7 a.m. that night, his son was allegedly near a lagoon on the island at 4 a.m. on May 30, 2005. The witness mentioned seeing a young man, wet from the waist down and missing a shoe, running from the lagoon toward a fast food restaurant. Shortly after, the young man was joined by an older individual who drove by in a red Jeep about 10 minutes later. Another lead came from Joran's ex-girlfriend, who reported that Joran had once mentioned being on the beach with someone capable of disposing of a body. To aid the search, the family hired a private investigator who spent nearly a year knocking on every door in Aruba. On October 21, 2005, Natalie's birthday, they were at an Aruban landfill, digging through garbage when the deputy police chief suggested shifting their search to the sea. A recent break-in at a fisherman's hut had resulted in the theft of items like fishing traps and tools that could potentially be used to sink a body. A businessman who had been following the case offered to fund a search of the seabed. In November 2007, a ship named Persistent set out for Aruba. On December 24th, they discovered what appeared to be a fishing trap approximately 90 feet deep. On December 29th, a remotely operated vehicle was sent to investigate, and it detected what seemed to be a skull. On December 30th, a diver from the ship joined Aruba's police divers, but they found no evidence related to Natalie. Despite persistent new clues and witness statements, each lead seemed to result in a dead end. In early 2008, a man who identified himself as Marcos contacted Beth Holloway, claiming that drug traffickers had been paid to dispose of Natalie's body at sea, but had instead transported her remains to Nicaragua and buried them. The private investigator traveled to Nicaragua to meet Marcos, who agreed to use a GPS tracker to locate the remains. Later, Marcos called the private detective, claiming he had found Natalie, stating that her body was wrapped in a tarp and badly decomposed. Marcos advised the detective to inform Beth Holloway immediately. However, the detective chose not to make the call, fearing it would only give Beth false hope. Marcos disappeared shortly thereafter. In February 2010, Paulus van der Sloot, Joran's father, suddenly died of a heart attack, leaving his son in a precarious situation. A month later, Joran, using the alias Jet Sanders, contacted John Kelly, the Holloway family attorney, in a desperate state. In an email, he claimed to know where Natalie's body was and offered to help the family, but only for a price. Joran demanded $250,000 in exchange for revealing the location and details of what had happened to Natalie, stating that he now wanted to be truthful. His father was dead. He had nothing to hide and he wanted to help the family, but at a cost. After Beth Holloway authorized the payment, John Kelly arranged a meeting with Joran in Aruba, initially offering $25,000 up front. Joran claimed to know where Natalie's body was, but when asked what would happen if he wasn't paid, he allegedly responded coldly, suggesting Beth could wait another 5 years. The family then turned to the FBI for assistance. They devised a plan to trick Joran into thinking he was being paid, aiming to catch him committing wire fraud. During their meetings, John transferred $25,000 to Joran. Joran led John to a house near the Aruba Racket Club, claiming that Natalie's remains were buried beneath freshly poured foundations before the house was built. He stated that on the night of Natalie's disappearance, they had argued on the beach, and in a fit of rage, he had thrown her, causing her to hit her head and die from blood loss. John doubted the truth of Joran's story, which suggested he initially hid the body on the beach with the help of his father before burying it. However, the house Joran pointed to hadn't been under construction since 2010. Authorities deemed the story insufficient to issue an arrest warrant. Joran continued to communicate with John until May 25th, when he claimed he was going to turn himself in. Instead, he fled to Peru with the extorted money. On June 30th, 2010, a federal grand jury indicted him on charges of wire fraud and extortion. Joran quickly reverted to his old ways after landing in Peru. He approached 21-year-old Stephanie Flores, a university student at the Atlantic City Casino in Lima, Peru. According to security footage, they played poker together for about an hour or two. After Stephanie had cashed in some chips, she left with Joran, heading to a hotel, where he picked up the key to room 309 at around 5 a.m. They were last seen ascending the stairs together, disappearing into the room. By mid-morning on May 30th, 2010, Joran was locked out of his room and called the front desk to be let in. He left 20 minutes later with only a backpack. The television in the room was left on, and he told the receptionist, "Don't disturb my girl," before departing. 2 days later, hotel staff discovered Stephanie's brutally beaten body inside room 309. Stephanie's father, Ricardo Flores, a well-known businessman and former race car driver, brought significant media attention to the case. Joran fled south and was eventually arrested in Chile. He tried to change his appearance, shaving his head and dyeing his hair blonde, discarding most of his belongings except his laptop. The Lima police reported that Joran initially denied the crime, but after 4 days in custody, he confessed to killing Stephanie. He claimed they went to his room to do some online gambling, but she briefly left and returned. When she did, she found information on his laptop linking him to Natalie Holloway's disappearance. This discovery caused her to panic and try to leave the room, which further enraged Joran. In a fit of fury, he killed her. Stephanie had suffered a neck fracture, likely leading to paralysis minutes before her death. The autopsy later revealed she was still conscious when Joran dropped her body to the floor and took a quick shower. Realizing she was still alive, he used his shirt to strangle her to death before fleeing. Joran added one final act of indignity by placing Stephanie's body in a suggestive position before leaving the room. The entire case shocked the public, as it seemed the past was repeating itself with another victim. Joran was charged with first-degree murder and robbery in Peru, along with wire fraud and extortion, is charged by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Birmingham, Alabama. His defense lawyer argued that the crime was involuntary manslaughter, but Joran ultimately pleaded guilty to the murder charges. The defense claimed Joran suffered from severe psychological trauma due to the Holloway case. The court sentenced him to 28.5 years in prison in 2012. This was the first victory for the Holloway family after years of trauma and agony. Beth Holloway visited Joran in the prison where he was held in September 2010. A Dutch documentary team provided a glimpse into how Joran survived in one of the harshest prisons in the world. Beth described the moment as liberating, stating that Joran's imprisonment was the culmination of her 5-year struggle. His incarceration marked a turning point for the victims' families, allowing them to move forward with their lives. In July 2014, Joran was set to marry his pregnant fiancée, Lydie Figueroa. Lydie told a local news outlet that she met Joran in 2010 while visiting another inmate with her cousin. Conjugal visits were permitted at the maximum security prison in northern Lima, where Joran spent the first years of his sentence. According to Lydie, her future husband had transformed into a new person. In August, Joran was transferred to another prison in the Andes Mountains, known for its harsher conditions, after allegedly threatening to kill the director of the previous prison. Lydie, who gave birth to a daughter in September, later claimed that Joran had been stabbed by a cellmate. These accusations were later denied by the director of Peru's National Penitentiary Institute, who called her a compulsive liar. In a 2015 interview, Lydie provided Fox News Latino with a letter Joran had written from prison, in which he alleged that Stephanie's father had put a $10,000 bounty on his head. "I don't want to die," he wrote. By this point, both the authorities and media knew that Joran was a compulsive liar and a sociopath, but the severity of his crimes and his refusal to show any signs of remorse, guilt, or fear only highlighted his manipulative nature. In June 2023, Joran was extradited to Birmingham, Alabama, to face extortion charges in federal court, where he initially pleaded not guilty. Later, in October, he changed his plea and confessed to killing Natalie as part of a plea deal, which resulted in a 20-year sentence for wire fraud and extortion, to be served concurrently with his ongoing sentence in Peru. Joran finally admitted to the chilling events of May 29, 2005, the night of Natalie's disappearance. According to him, the Calpo brothers dropped them off at the beach. Natalie began feeling ill and Joran claimed she kissed him briefly. But when he made further advances, she rejected him and kneed him in the groin. In response, Joran angrily kicked her in the head and then picked up a cinder block, the same one he said he found on the beach, and smashed her head with it. He then dragged Natalie's body into the ocean. The statute of limitations for filing murder charges in Aruba is 12 years. A spokesperson for the island's prosecutors requested that the U.S. Department of Justice provide its office with Joran's files before deciding on any prosecutorial steps. Natalie Holloway's case remains open in Aruba and has become one of the most famous missing person cases in the U.S. Losing a family member in foreign lands forever and witnessing the horrifying events that unfolded has surpassed any conceivable terror. Whether it was the laxity of the Aruba Police Department or the actions of those associated with Joran, all had a role in the disappearance of Natalie, a bright pre-med student who lost her life far too soon due to negligence. This case has raised many questions about law enforcement, the media, and society as a whole. Aaron was born on July 15, 1994, in the United States to unknown parents. Fortunately, she was adopted by Lore and William, a couple from Tennessee. They had 7 children in total, with 5 of them being adopted, including Aaron. For Lore and William, adopting was more than a decision. It was about following a divine command to help those in need, especially since some of their adopted children had special needs. For instance, their youngest, Trisha, was born with multiple birth defects. From early childhood, while growing up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Aaron showed a remarkable and unconditional love for animals. Her mother cherished memories of Aaron being the only one who could make a rabbit walk on a leash as if it were a dog. Kind-hearted and gentle, Aaron enjoyed the benefits of having a loving and united family, facing only the usual challenges of any average household. When Trisha passed away at just 3.5 years old, Lore and William helped their grieving children understand the importance of having provided a happy life for her. Over time, Aaron turned her affinity for animals into a special talent for taming horses that no one else could tame. She had a pony named Riley at a stable near her home. In 5th grade, she met Jonathan Corwin, a boy a year older than her. Initially, they were not particularly close, but about 5 years later, they started chatting on social media. By then, Aaron's protective nature had led her to become the mother of dozens of animals, ranging from fish and guinea pigs to dogs and cats, all of whom she welcomed and cared for. Eventually, Jonathan plucked up the courage to ask her out, choosing her 16th birthday for the date. With her parents' permission, their love blossomed. Their romance, full of poem exchanges and shared dreams, turned them into the quintessential American couple. After finishing high school, Aaron found employment at a local tractor supply company, spending her free time with her horse or scouring garage sales with her mother and siblings. Meanwhile, Jonathan joined the Marine Infantry, and without hesitation about their bright future, they married in Las Vegas in November 2012. The following year, Jonathan learned he would be transferred to California. While the prospect excited both him and Aaron, they planned to return to East Tennessee as soon as possible. In September 2013, the newlyweds moved to their new home at the Marine base in San Bernardino County. In turn, the location served as one of the entry points to Joshua Tree National Park. Here, they met new people, such as the couple Connor and Aisling Maliki, who live with their young son Brian on the ground floor of the same block as Aaron and her husband. Amid daily tasks, Jonathan also struck up a friendship with another colleague, Christopher Brandon Lee. Son of Karen Lee and hailing from Anchorage, Alaska, Christopher was a Marine who had been going through tough times after returning from a tour in Afghanistan. He lived on the base with his wife Nicole and their 6-year-old daughter Liberty. Like Aaron, the couple shared a love for horses. Soon, the 3 couples became friends. While their husbands were on duty, Aaron, Aisling, and Nicole would visit each other to have lunch and chat. When Jonathan, Connor, and Christopher were at home, they would cook or watch movies and TV shows in any of their apartments. It seemed like each home was everyone's home. Additionally, Christopher and his wife Nicole became horse sponsors at the Roca Blanca Ranch, which also hosted a non-profit organization dedicated to animal care and protection. Isabel Megley owned the site. Naturally, upon learning about it, Aaron joined the initiative. Amid their military duties, everything seemed to go smoothly. Initially, Christopher seemed to fit well with the uniform, but over time, other Marines noticed he often displayed a mix of disorder and insolence in handling weapons. An officer later reprimanded him for treating rifles and rocket launchers as if they were toys, earning Christopher a reputation for being reckless. For the Corwins, everyday life, far from their respective families, presented challenges that strained their relationship beyond the honeymoon phase. Their youth also meant they were not fully prepared for the challenges of marriage, often arguing over money and accusing each other of overspending. However, when Aaron became pregnant, all disagreements and bitterness between her and Jonathan dissolved. She was so happy with the news that she announced it with a blue and pink post on her social media profile. Unfortunately, just a few weeks later, Aaron suffered a miscarriage, which devastated her emotionally. To make matters worse, Jonathan's frequent deployments for military exercises far from the base added physical and emotional distance, as she felt he was unable to console her. Consequently, the cracks in their marriage not only reappeared, but also deepened. During the free time they shared, Christopher had been watching Aaron and found it easy to discern the depth of sadness on her face. From that moment, he began spending more time with Aaron without Nicole around. On a Sunday night in February 2014, the Lees joined the Corwins in their apartment. Jonathan and Nicole chose to watch a zombie series episode, but Aaron, put off by the violence, declined to join. Instead of staying with his wife, Christopher went with Aaron to the master bedroom to play video games. Alone, sitting side by side on the floor, they spent a few minutes in front of the screen until one of them paused the game and they looked at each other. Suddenly, they shared their first kiss. Although it lasted only a moment, that intimate gesture changed everything, and they began an affair that quickly escalated in intensity. Soon, Aaron and Christopher were talking about leaving their spouses and how great a stepmother she would be to Liberty, whom she frequently cared for. Meanwhile, Nicole sensed her husband's growing distance and soon checked his cell phone, discovering the text messages between Christopher and Aaron. Nicole was furious and confronted Christopher with a monologue filled with bitter words that lasted for hours. She didn't stop there, though. She also informed Jonathan about the affair, causing a heated confrontation that lasted through the night. When Aaron tried to leave, Nicole, eyes blazing with rage, screamed threats at her. Aaron and Christopher ended their affair, but weeks later, they resumed their secret meetings. Around this time, Christopher wrote Aaron a poem, urging her not to give up. Meanwhile, unaware of the ongoing betrayal, Jonathan was determined to make his marriage work. Then, on June 22, 2014, as Aaron anxiously awaited her mother's first visit to California, she discovered she was pregnant again, this time undoubtedly with Christopher's child. Though she didn't announce it on social media, she told him. Initially, Christopher feigned happiness, but in reality he was displeased, fearing the news could disrupt his plans. Despite promising a future together to Aaron, Christopher had no intention of leaving his wife and was greatly fearful of Nicole's potential reaction to the pregnancy. His time in the Marines was nearing its end. On July 4, 2014, he was scheduled to finish his service and then planned to return to Alaska with his wife, leaving behind the tumultuous affair. The next day, Christopher told Isabel that he had been exploring the desert and was thrilled about the interesting things he had found, particularly excited about discovering a hard-to-reach mine shaft. He then asked to borrow a white propane tank that she owned. Isabel had no objections. Meanwhile, he started researching online how to dispose of a body. Then, he messaged Aaron to invite her for a surprise romantic evening in the national park. Filled with excitement, Aaron immediately texted a friend in Tennessee to share the news. They speculated about the true intentions of her lover and the mention of a surprise element. When her friend sent a text with a ring emoji, Aaron admitted she was excited about the possibility of a marriage proposal. The date was set for June 28th. Christopher told his wife he had planned a coyote hunting trip in Joshua Tree National Park with Connor, which conveniently allowed him to take his Winchester .22 caliber rifle. Early that day, he also loaded up the propane tank and gasoline. Before leaving, he mentioned to Nicole that Connor had canceled so he would go alone. Around 7:30 that morning, Aaron told Jonathan she was heading to Joshua Tree National Park to explore the trails that she and her mother could later bike on. She kissed him goodbye and said she loved him, leading her husband to believe that their life was returning to normal. Once at the meeting point, Aaron faced a harsh disillusionment. Not only was there no dream marriage proposal, but Christopher also made it clear that he had no affection for her whatsoever. She was confronted with a man consumed by anger, with her as the target of his rage. What happened next is largely known only to him, but it is known that he fired shots into the air before using a rope tied to 2 reinforcement bars to strangle Aaron, cutting off her air supply. After she fell to the ground, he checked her vital signs and, ensuring she was not breathing, threw her into the mine shaft he had discovered days earlier. Aaron fell 76 meters deep. As hours passed with no news from his wife, Jonathan became anxious. He tried calling her at least 50 times and eventually reported her missing the next morning. When the young soldier also contacted his mother-in-law, she suspected that her daughter, who always had trouble with directions, might have gotten lost in the vast national park. Several days passed with no information about Aaron's whereabouts. When new information finally emerged, it was far from reassuring. A woman living in a remote area noticed that a car had been parked near her house for several days, which was very unusual. She took pictures of the car and shared them, hoping the owner would appear. These photos turned out to be crucial, as it was discovered that the car belonged to Aaron. When the police informed Aaron's family that they had found her car abandoned several kilometers north of the park, she felt a stab in her heart. To her, it was almost a certain sign that her daughter had encountered something sinister. The police shared a similar sentiment. From that point, the authorities had 2 tasks, one more challenging than the other. The first task was to gather evidence to prosecute a potential attacker. In this regard, San Bernardino's detectives began to delve into Aaron's life and soon uncovered hidden aspects that might have endangered her. It was through their investigations that Jonathan learned his wife's affair had continued in secret. This detail quickly led the police to rule out the husband as a suspect. Instead, Christopher became the focus of their investigation, especially after tire tracks found near Aaron's car seemed to match his vehicle. Consequently, on July 1st, 2014, Christopher was interviewed by the police. By then, he had hidden his rifle at Isabel's ranch. Christopher initially apologized for not disclosing his relationship with Aaron, claiming their interactions had never crossed the boundaries set by their respective marriages. Then, unexpectedly, he claimed that Aaron had confided in him about being a victim of domestic abuse. Regarding the Saturday she disappeared, he admitted being in the national park area alone, ostensibly to hunt coyotes, hence firing his gun at rocks. However, the police confronted him with the evidence, leading Christopher to change his story. Without a body, the investigators could not pressure him further. At that point, there was no way to prove Aaron was deceased. So after 9 hours lacking sufficient evidence to charge him, the authorities had to let Christopher go. The police were convinced that the story provided by the main suspect was highly unusual and implausible. Later, when the detectives spoke with Nicole, they noted her uncooperative attitude, almost as if she resented the investigation. Christopher was eventually discharged from the Marine Corps, and as planned, he and his wife packed their bags, loaded their truck, and, along with Little Liberty, headed back to Alaska. Meanwhile, The police's second and more daunting task was to locate Aaron's remains and prove that this was not a mere case of spontaneous disappearance. The investigation seemed to stall, and the detectives were frustrated. Until Isabel remembered that the week before Aaron's disappearance, Christopher had mentioned going to the national park with a friend to explore mines, referencing one that nobody would find. Determined to follow this lead, they sought the help of a local expert, skilled and familiar with the scattered mines across the terrain. Guided by this expert, the investigators and volunteers in California began a meticulous search for Aaron in the park. They covered 3,000 square kilometers of wilderness, with 6 different law enforcement agencies eventually getting involved. However, after several weeks of searching, there were no favorable results, leading to the difficult decision to end the operation on Saturday, August 16, 2014. Yet, in a surprising twist of fate on that day, a spelunker noticed a strong smell of gasoline coming from one of the mines. In the final hours of that day, volunteers lowered a bucket with a camera into the mine. At 9 meters down, the oxygen level in the pit was toxic, and further down, near 30 meters, they discovered what appeared to be a body. After a tremendous effort in the late hours of that Saturday in August, the body was retrieved, 2 months after Aaron's disappearance. A propane tank was also found at the bottom of the mine, believed to be part of a failed attempt to destroy the victim's body. The remains were airlifted to the local morgue, where, due to advanced decomposition, dental records were used for identification. It was confirmed to be Aaron, who had died from asphyxiation caused by an object still clutched around her neck. Additionally, it was revealed that she was pregnant. The shocking discovery that Aaron and her unborn child had been killed sent her family on an emotional roller coaster. Though it was the worst possible news, for her mother at least, it was more bearable than the ongoing uncertainty of not knowing her whereabouts. For now, her mother only hoped that her daughter's body would be returned to Tennessee for a proper burial. With Christopher having the motive, means, an opportunity, and evidence piling up against him, he was soon arrested by a police officer in Anchorage, and his vehicle was confiscated. Inside the car, beneath the passenger seat, authorities found a homemade object similar to the one found around Aaron's neck. This led the police to interview Christopher's mother. Although she knew nothing about the item and claimed never to have seen it, a search of her home later uncovered a magazine edition featuring an article on Aaron's case. Following Christopher's arrest, the case attracted national media attention. Shortly after, the San Bernardino's police held a press conference to provide details on the case. They mentioned that Christopher was the main suspect in the crime. They also searched Isabel's ranch to her utter astonishment, where they found and seized a rifle owned by Christopher. Further complicating his situation, investigators discovered incriminating search histories on his internet activity. Consequently, Christopher was charged with first-degree murder. On Friday, September 19, 2014, hundreds of candles flickered in silent memory and tribute to Aaron and the unborn child whose life was cut short. Approximately 250 people attended the vigil, many wearing special T-shirts with Aaron's name on the front and a Bible verse on the back. During this time, Jonathan agreed to speak with only one media outlet among the many seeking his comment. In an interview, he expressed his hatred for Christopher's actions, but stated he felt that harboring hatred every time he saw him would eventually consume him. Jonathan revealed that he had learned about the rekindled affair and that his wife disappeared when she went to see Christopher, who was still his next-door neighbor. Part of him wanted to confront Christopher violently, but he refrained, believing it would make him no better than Christopher. Jonathan did not want to be a bad person. The legal process for obtaining justice for Aaron Corwin began 2 years later in October 2016. From the outset of the trial against Christopher, the prosecution easily established his penchant for violence and his motive and opportunity to commit the crime. On Wednesday, October 19th, a forensic scientist testified that a .22 caliber bullet casing was found near the mine where Aaron's body was discovered, and the firing pin marks on the casing matched Christopher's gun. When it was the defense's turn, Christopher was presented as the sole witness. He took the stand and, despite confirming all evidence against him, confessed to killing Aaron. However, he then offered a narrative of the events that was clearly not only false but also desperate. He claimed he had suspected that Aaron had abused his daughter while caring for her, leading to a so-called revelation on that fateful Saturday in the desert. In light of his narrative, Christopher believed he had ample justification for his actions, clearly hoping that his macabre story would result in a lesser sentence. Throughout the trial, he maintained a demeanor of cooperation and calmness. However, the jury did not believe a single word of his account. After just 15 minutes of deliberation, Christopher Brandon Lee was found guilty of first-degree murder. The following month, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In response to the tragedy, Aaron's family and some civic groups advocated for a petition to the Bureau of Land Management, urging them to provide funding and resources to seal abandoned vertical mine shafts, starting with the one where Aaron Corwin perished. Recognizing the enormity of the task and acknowledging that some public areas had already been closed, they requested prioritization for this particular area to prevent similar tragedies from affecting other families. Reflecting on the entire ordeal and the relief of reaching a conclusive verdict, Aaron's mother admitted feeling emotionally and physically drained by the end of the sentencing hearing. She had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for over 2 years, with her grief so heavy that she could barely walk. Yet, following the verdict and sentencing, she felt an immense burden lifted off her shoulders, likening her emotional response to the day she finally adopted Aaron. She described years of uncertainty in the adoption process and how all the stress vanished the moment she gave Aaron her last name, mirroring her relief upon hearing Christopher's sentence. As for Jonathan Corwin, Aaron's husband, he chose to shield himself from media overexposure and was taking steps to rebuild his life after the tragic loss. On the morning of July 18, 2019, thousands of Japanese people in the city of Kyoto were surprised in the middle of their usual morning activities by a very unusual event. That morning, out of nowhere, the entire city could hear the sound of multiple ambulances and fire trucks racing through Kyoto with their sirens blaring, startling the entire population. Most Japanese who witnessed the massive mobilization of ambulances and patrols couldn't help but wonder what could be the cause of this, while simultaneously thinking that whatever it was, it had to be something serious because all these vehicles seemed to be heading to the same location, disregarding the usual heavy traffic in Kyoto mid-morning, causing all cars and bicycles on the road to give way to the authorities. By 11 a.m. on this summer morning, it became apparent to the population that indeed, all this professional equipment was heading to the same building. Emergency services had received multiple calls reporting an explosion heard around 10:30 in the morning, and the worst part was that the building was reported to be engulfed in flames. As the fire quickly spread throughout the first floor, most of the people inside couldn't escape the flames. This place was an office complex belonging to the company Kyoto Animation, an animation studio founded in 1981 that had produced various anime and manga novels of all kinds. Throughout its history, it has released great works that have captivated both Japanese and international audiences due to its high production standards. Alerted by the calls they had received, which evidenced the severity of the situation, the emergency services instructed all available personnel to arrive at the scene as quickly as possible. When they arrived at the building, the situation looked much worse than expected. Several neighbors who lived nearby were observing the scene from what they thought was a safe distance while they waited for the firefighters and paramedics. The scene of the fire was, to put it mildly, disheartening. The flames enveloped the entire building and leaped out of the windows, creating long tongues of fire that immediately hindered the efforts of the firefighters trying to contain the fire and rescue those who were still trapped inside what had become a deadly concrete trap. The police officers began to instruct the neighbors to move further away from the scene, as in many cases of fires and explosions, there was a significant possibility that the building could collapse. According to reports at the time, there were 73 company employees working there at the moment of the fire. From the moment they set foot on the street, the paramedics knew they had a lot of work to do, because even the employees who had managed to escape the offices were now at the foot of the burning building, seriously injured, some unable to move or unconscious. Most of them had suffered terrible injuries and cuts while trying to exit the building. The most terrible part was that most of them had severe third-degree burns. These are classified as such because they affect the deepest layers of the skin and require immediate medical attention, as they have a high risk of infection. Additionally, when a person has these burns in multiple parts of their body, or almost entirely, as was the case with some of these studio workers, the chances of losing their life are very high. For this reason, it was crucial that the workers receive timely treatment, so emergency doctors began to separate the injured according to the severity of their injuries in order to assist those who needed urgent medical help. This way, the most affected individuals began to be stabilized before being transported to the hospital by ambulance. At this point, the number of severely injured people was so high that more than 30 ambulances had to be mobilized in total to transport the victims of the supposed accident. It's important to clarify that the authorities believed before arriving at the scene that this was an accidental fire. However, what was happening just a block away from the scene would give a very drastic twist to this story. Just 100 meters from the burning building, some police officers from a nearby train station were detaining a man who had been chased there by Kyoto animation employees. The man had serious burns on his face and various parts of his body. This raised several questions because why would the authorities subdue a man who appeared to be a victim of the fire? In addition to all this, multiple witnesses were reporting to the police officers present at the scene that they had seen a man enter the animation studio around 10:30 that morning with what appeared to be bottles of gasoline. So with this and the testimonies of the survivors of the tragedy who were conscious, the authorities understood that this was an arson attack and therefore a mass murder. When the firefighters were able to control the fire enough to enter the building and analyze the scene, they observed that the death toll of this tragedy had risen to 34 people. Shortly after, it would increase to 36, as 2 of the injured, suffering from the effects of their burns, could not endure any longer and lost their lives. The man was arrested, as the same employees who had pursued him claimed that he was responsible, and the same police officers who had arrested him during his transfer to the hospital testified that this man began shouting that yes, he was the one who had caused the fire at Kyoto Animation, justifying it by saying that everyone inside deserved to die because they had stolen his work without giving him any recognition. Once at the hospital, the first thing known was that the suspect's name was Shinji Alba, and he was 41 years old. He had many injuries covering his entire body from the fire he allegedly caused. Once his wounds had healed enough for him to be kept in a cell without dying from an infection, a lengthy interrogation awaited him so that the entire country and the world would have an idea of what motivated him to commit such a horrible crime. Not much is known about this man's childhood, as his parents were born in a small village. Shinji's maternal grandfather was an honorable man who had taken on 2 jobs simultaneously to support his family. He mainly worked transporting goods by cart to Tokyo. He was considered a very kind and hardworking man until one day he was diagnosed with advanced cancer and, unable to afford the treatment that would save him, he made the decision to take his own life to avoid burdening his family with the responsibility of helping him. Shinji's mother would meet the man who would become the father of her children during her adolescence. The problem arose because this man was almost 17 years older than her when they met, and it was known that he was married at the time. As a result, the woman's family strongly disapproved of their relationship, which is a very serious matter in Japan, as Japanese society places a significant emphasis on appearances. However, against all odds, she escaped from her parents' home, never to return. After running away, she started working in a factory near Kyoto, and eventually she got married with the older man. The couple had 3 children, of whom there is only information available about Shinji and his sister. After leading what seemed to be a relatively normal life, it appears that Shinji's mother wanted some excitement and began an affair with a much younger man than her husband. When she was caught, she left home, leaving her husband, who earned a living as a taxi driver, completely alone and responsible for their 3 children. This continued to be the family's normal life until 1999, when a car accident left the father paralyzed. He was subsequently fired from the taxi company where he worked, leaving the man, who was already struggling to make ends meet, without the possibility of working to pay rent and provide food for his 3 children. Faced with this overwhelming pressure and distress, the man made the tragic decision to end it all. Despite all this, up to a certain point, Shinji had led a relatively normal life in his youth. Nothing out of the ordinary happened during his high school years, and he even worked part-time as a document clerk for the government. After graduating, Shinji continued to work part-time at a supermarket, and when he reached his 20s, he decided to move to another city. Everything seemed to be going relatively well until his mother's disappearance and his father's death, which slowly caused his life to crumble. The young man increasingly lacked motivation to move forward, and just when he thought things couldn't get any worse, life dealt him another blow. Shinji's sister, about whom little information is available, was almost at the point of losing hope. On that day, this woman visited a temple in the city, where she started talking to a priest about all the pain she had suffered in recent years. She then prayed for the repose of her father's soul before leaving the temple without saying a word. The next day after this visit, her lifeless body was found in a hostel near the temple she had visited, and she was determined to be the cause of her own tragic ending. After his sister's death, Shinji's life began to spiral downhill. His mental and economic problems led him to commit a robbery in 2012, where he managed to escape with around 20,000 yen in his bag. However, he was arrested shortly afterward and subsequently sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. Upon his release, Shinji became a complete social outcast. Nobody wanted anything to do with him. He had no family or friends, and he struggled to maintain any relationships due to his violent temper. This isolation led him to withdraw completely into his apartment. Like a significant portion of the Japanese population, Shinji loved manga and anime. Since childhood, he had dreamt of becoming a manga writer. Faced with a bleak future and difficulties finding employment, Shinji decided to pursue his dream. He began writing light novels and drawing manga panels. At this point, Shinji's story intersects with that of Kyoto Animation, a company with an excellent reputation not only in Japan, but also internationally. Kyoto Animation's specialty is depicting the wonders and dilemmas of everyday life. In other words, they create works with characters that look childlike or relatable, making it easy for viewers to connect with them quickly. However, they often incorporate plot twists that can leave you in tears. Every year, this animation company holds a manga and novel writing contest, where enthusiasts submit their works in the hopes of getting them published or adapted by the studio, or even turned into a big screen production. In 2018, Shinji submitted one of his novels for the contest, following all the specified steps. However, despite constantly checking his email for responses, he received no reply from the animation studio. As the days passed, 40-year-old Shinji felt that his hope of becoming a successful manga writer was slipping through his fingers. Several months later, on one of those afternoons when all Shinji did was watch anime and play video games, he started watching an anime produced by Kyoto Animation. The show told the story of high school students who were involved in long-distance shooting sports. That very afternoon, Shinji felt humiliated because he realized that his idea had been stolen. Yes, you heard it right. A giant studio worth millions of dollars had allegedly stolen his story without giving him the slightest credit. Maybe they didn't steal his entire manga idea, but they had apparently lifted a scene directly from his work. Shinji was outraged because he believed that in the submission he had sent to Kyoto Animation, there was a rather inconsequential scene in which the anime's protagonists were in a supermarket buying discounted meat. According to him, this scene was identical to one in an episode of the show that had aired that week. The scene was quite generic and nothing out of the ordinary. However, likely due to his unstable mental state and isolation, Shinji couldn't stop obsessing over the idea that his idea had been stolen. He was filled with anger, wondering how they could have not even bothered to respond to his contest submission and had apparently taken advantage of his creativity without giving him the slightest credit. In reality, according to the studio, Shinji's novel submission had not passed the first elimination round conducted by the contest judges, which was why they hadn't bothered to contact him. Nevertheless, from the very beginning, Shinji demonstrated that he wasn't mentally well and acted on the belief that he had been personally attacked and blatantly robbed. All of this brings us to July 14, 2019, 4 days before the fire. 9 months earlier, Shinji had sent anonymous threats to Kyoto Animation, threatening them with death. Over 200 emails had been sent, and although employees had reported this to the police, nothing could be done because the emails were encrypted and Shinji had waited for them to let their guard down. On that Sunday, a neighbor heard Shinji starting to hit the shared wall between their apartments. These two lived in apartments where every sound from the other side could be heard. Shinji, among them, used to be the noisiest, and they would occasionally bang on the walls to request silence from one another. However, this time, it turned out that the neighbor from the apartment above was moving, and consequently, they were the cause of the noise. The neighbor went to knock on Shinji's door, intending to explain that he wasn't the one making the noise and to please stop banging on the wall. Before he had a chance to speak, Shinji angrily opened the door, grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, and yelled at him, "You're making too much noise. Shut up, or I'll kill you." Faced with this aggression, all of the neighbor's feelings turned to horror. From Shinji's demeanor, it was evident that he was perfectly capable of carrying out his threat. Without hesitation, he left the scene and called the police to report the assault. However, when the officers arrived at Shinji's apartment, he was already gone. It seems that this incident was the spark that would lead Shinji to commit his final act. The next day, Shinji took a bullet train to travel to Tokyo. He stayed in a hotel and then, on Tuesday, headed to Kyoto, his final destination, where he stayed in another hotel. Several security cameras captured him in the areas near the animation studio. Several neighbors also remembered him clearly after the incident because Shinji wore the same red t-shirt and light jeans for all 4 days. Shinji spent several hours walking until he stopped at a store and bought a shopping cart. He then proceeded to a gas station where he bought 10 gallons of gasoline. With these supplies, Shinji stashed the cart and went to sleep, ready to carry out his evil plan early the next morning. On July 18, 2019, Shinji returned to the animation studio building around 10:30 in the morning, carrying his containers filled with gasoline. Upon entering, he blocked the 12 emergency exits and began to douse the studio with gasoline, taking advantage of the building's limited security, as such incidents are quite rare in Japan. Once everything was ready, Shinji struck a match, and everything started to burn. When the first people realized there was a fire, they attempted to escape through the emergency exits, but they were blocked. They ran towards the central exit where Shinji was present, still holding a gasoline container, and he began to douse the employees trying to escape while saying the word "die." This caused many people to run out into the street engulfed in flames. In just a moment, smoke had already reached the second floor of the building, and for those inside, it was too late to evacuate without suffering injuries. The building was completely engulfed in smoke in less than 2 minutes, making it difficult to breathe, and gradually, the animation studio workers began to lose consciousness due to the lack of oxygen. Most of the company's employees were on the top floor because the attack occurred during a meeting with executives from another company. It's unclear if Shinji planned this to claim more victims, but unfortunately, that day there were more people in the building than usual. To make matters worse, shortly after, an explosion rocked the building, causing the flames to burst through the windows and doors of the studio. The police believe that the combination of air and flames led to the explosion. As the fire grew, people inside the building tried to escape the flames. The majority of the victims, specifically 19 of them, were found on the 3rd floor near the stairs leading to the emergency exit on the roof. These individuals unknowingly ended up on this staircase, which acted like an oven. After causing this hellish scene, Shinji accidentally set himself on fire with the same gasoline he had used to try to burn his victims. This led him to flee the scene, but an employee of Kyoto Animation did not accept this and started to chase him. Eventually, they all ended up at a train station located 100 meters from where Shinji was finally apprehended by 2 police officers from the same station. The fire was completely extinguished after 5 hours of immense efforts by the police and firefighters. It was at this point that the authorities were able to accurately count the victims of the incident. In this attack, 36 people lost their lives, while another 34 were left with serious injuries. Of the deceased, 28 died from carbon monoxide poisoning, 6 succumbed to their burns, and 2 passed away while receiving medical treatment at the hospital. It was reported that 2/3 of the fatal victims who worked at the studio were women, as Kyoto Animation was known for hiring women in almost all of its animation positions. After spending 10 months in the hospital, Shinji was officially arrested and processed. There were concerns about his physical health, and questions arose as to whether he would be physically capable of enduring the lengthy trial schedule ahead of him. His hospital treatment had taken so long because he had suffered burns on 90% of his body. In such cases, skin donors are crucial, but the Japanese authorities correctly prioritized obtaining donors for the victims. As for Shinji, he had no other option but to accept artificial skin, becoming the first person to undergo such a significant surgery of this kind without using real skin transplants. The judicial processes in Japan are known to be slow, as they usually involve multiple stages before a clear conviction is obtained. Since the trials for Shinji began, he underwent numerous psychiatric and psychological evaluations to determine if he was mentally healthy at the time of the crime. The results were somewhat mixed because, on one hand, it was clear that Shinji's brain did not function normally, but on the other hand, he was aware of what he was doing, making it difficult to predict what sentence he would receive. The decision had to be something between the death penalty and life imprisonment. The world was deeply affected by this crime, especially the animation industry. After the fire, an American anime licensor launched a successful GoFundMe campaign with a goal of $750,000 to assist the studio and the victims' families. In less than 24 hours, they raised over $1 million for this purpose. Even the then Prime Minister of Japan expressed condolences to the families, a figure many may recognize as he was assassinated a couple of years later. The president of Kyoto Animation mentioned that he did not plan to rebuild the studio in the same location, as it would be traumatic and bring bad memories for the employees. Instead, he considered demolishing the remains of the studio to create a park with a monument dedicated to the staff and the local community. Today, most of Kyoto Animation's employees have returned to work, this time in the company's second studio. One of these employees is a veteran manga artist who has been working at Kyoto Animation since the 1980s. He returned to work after the incident, having recovered from the injuries he sustained. He mentioned that he feels better when he is working than resting. He also expressed his intention to make his future work a tribute to those who perished. Another significant detail worth mentioning is that as a result of this tragedy, Japan decided to implement a new law. It requires citizens to present identification and provide reasons for their gasoline purchases when buying it in lighters or containers. Molly Bish was born on August 2, 1983, in Warren, Massachusetts. She was the youngest of 3 children in the Bish family. With her siblings Heather and John Jr., Molly was a bright, responsible, and dearly loved and active girl. The Bish family originally hailed from Detroit, Michigan, but they moved to Massachusetts in search of a better future. The reason for their relocation was a disturbing crime that occurred in their Detroit neighborhood. A young woman had been kidnapped on her way home from work and later found murdered. The Bish couple thought Warren would be a much safer place to raise their children, and this seemed to hold true for the next 15 years. Molly, always seeking new activities, had taken a summer job as a lifeguard at Commons Pond in Warren. She was excited about this opportunity as it was her brother John Jr.'s former job, and he had requested that Molly be given the chance to continue in his place. Molly was fully committed to her job and wanted to perform it to the best of her ability to make her brother proud. On June 26, 2000, Magi accompanied Molly to the pond for her 7th day of work. When they arrived at the parking lot, Magi noticed a strange man. He was smoking a cigarette and sitting in a new white car. His presence made her uncomfortable. She looked at him, but he didn't acknowledge her. Magi accompanied Molly to her lifeguard station and stayed a little longer, hoping the man would be gone when she returned to the parking lot. However, when she got back to her vehicle, the stranger was still there. They locked eyes for several seconds, and fearing for Molly's safety, Magi waited inside her car for several minutes until the unknown man finally left. On June 27, 2000, Molly's 8th day on the job, she and her mother stopped at a local store just before 10 in the morning. Molly purchased everything she needed for her shift as a lifeguard. When they arrived at the isolated pond surrounded by mostly woods, Magi dropped off her daughter, who hurried to her station since she was running a bit late. Molly arrived a few minutes later at her station and quickly set up her chair, towel, and all her work equipment just after 10 in the morning. Swimming lessons were scheduled to begin soon, and she wanted everything in order to welcome the children. The beach was officially open, but Molly was alone, and it seemed that everyone was running late that day. No houses overlooked the water, and the beach wasn't visible from the road, which was located at the end of a dead-end street. In all directions, there were only trees. At 10 in the morning, Sandra and her children arrived to set up camp, followed by other families. They looked around for Molly but couldn't find her at her workstation. That morning, Molly hadn't used her police radio, which was part of her daily routine. Besides the open first aid kit, there was nothing to indicate that she had been engaged in any activities there. Even her shoes were neatly placed in front of her chair. When swimming lessons ended, one of the parents contacted park commissioner to report that Molly had disappeared, as it was uncharacteristic of her to leave her workstation unattended. The park commissioner arrived at the beach shortly after 11 in the morning, and at 11:44, he used his two-way radio to inform the police that the young girl had not shown up. He also examined her personal belongings left at the scene. From that point onward, some irregular events occurred that raised suspicions. At some point between noon and the afternoon, he ran into John Jr. at a hardware store, and for an unknown reason, he didn't mention that Molly had disappeared. Another irregularity was that the police didn't contact Molly's mother until 1 in the afternoon, 3 hours after Magi had dropped her off at her new job. Part of the reason for the delay, according to some accounts, was that people thought Molly might have gotten a ride to visit a friend, which was a logical assumption considering she had left her belongings by her workstation. Alarmed after receiving the call about her daughter's absence, the mother hurried to the location, where she found Molly's sandals, chair, first aid kit, radio, and lunch by the shore. However, there was no sign of her. Hours later, after the scene of the disappearance, and any potential evidence had been trampled by beachgoers, children, dogs, and curious onlookers who roamed freely, the police realized that their initial assessments might have been wrong. The first theory that Molly had simply gone off with friends made sense for an ordinary teenager, but not for someone as responsible as she was. So the second theory gained strength, suggesting that Molly had drowned in the pond. At that moment, it seemed the most plausible explanation. It's worth noting that Warren was the kind of small town where nothing much happened, and there were no records of violent crimes. With its picturesque houses and natural beauty, it seemed like a safe place to raise a family. In fact, that was the reason the Bish couple had moved there in the first place. Police investigation began with the basics, analyzing the teenager's belongings and work tools, and something chilling occurred. The unknown man became a suspect because all witnesses saw how he touched and examined everything within his reach upon arriving at the disappearance scene, without gloves or care. May J. informed officers that she had seen a mysterious man lurking around the pond in the days before. With this information, the county sheriff's office initiated an investigation. The local worker testified that he had seen the same man in the white sit-in, but he didn't see him in Molly's worksite parking lot. The car was parked near a nearby cemetery that was connected to the pond by a short path. On the morning of June 27, the day of Molly's disappearance, a truck was unloading sand for the beach. In the investigation, the truck driver was questioned, and he reported seeing the man parked in the lot a few minutes before Magi and Molly arrived. Police officers searched the pond and the surrounding woods but couldn't find Molly. Although there were no signs of a struggle at the scene, both the police and her family were convinced she had been abducted. The police focused their investigation on the unknown man in the white car, based on descriptions provided by Magi, and the two witnesses. A composite sketch of the man was created and circulated. He was described as a man with brown hair, dark eyes, and approximately 50 years old, possibly a heavy smoker since everyone who saw him mentioned he had a cigarette in hand. Simultaneously, a thorough investigation was launched, including the examination of local sex offenders to identify any matching the suspect's description, but no identification was made. The investigation into Molly's case became the largest and most costly search for a missing person ever conducted in the state of Massachusetts. The abduction gained significant notoriety and extensive media coverage. Following Molly's forced absence, her family created a website to spread awareness of the case to a broader audience. They also established an email chain to reach as many people as possible. Over 30,000 U.S. residents received emails about her disappearance. In 2001, Magi reached out to the renowned sketch artist, who agreed to create a composite sketch of Molly's abductor. The two met at a place, which are private accommodations in both rural and urban settings that offer bed and breakfast at rates lower than local hotels. They spent 9 hours chatting while they worked on the composite sketch. When it was completed, Magi felt it was accurate, except for one detail. She requested the artist to update the drawing to include a cigarette in the man's hand. The next day, when the artist showed her the updated result, Maggie was certain that the composite sketch was identical to the man she had seen. In May 2003, a hunter reported finding a blue swimsuit. He contacted the police because he had seen information about Molly's case and knew that she had been wearing a blue swimsuit when she disappeared. This lead turned out to be of great significance, and an intensive search in the forest began immediately. Tracking efforts, involving experts of various kinds, continued for several years. Finally, on June 9, 2003, Molly's body was discovered a little over 8 kilometers from her home. The official cause of death was not disclosed, but it was known that she had been murdered and buried in the dense vegetation on Whiskey Hill. The police continued their relentless efforts to find the person responsible, not just for the kidnapping, but for Molly's homicide. However, the case quickly went cold. In 2005, a man with a striking resemblance to the composite sketch was considered a suspect in an attempted kidnapping, but he couldn't be linked to Molly's case. In 2007, a registered sex offender was identified after attempting to abduct and assault a jogger just a few kilometers from Warren. He also matched the description of the suspect, but the police didn't press charges, and the reasons were never made public. In 2009, Rodney Stanger, who had recently been convicted of murder, became the prime suspect in Molly's abduction and murder. He had lived just a few kilometers from the town where Molly resided and moved to Florida shortly after her disappearance. Rodney also drove a white car, frequently fished at Commons Pond, and was an avid hunter in the area where Molly's body was found. He also fit the description that Molly's mother had provided to the police of the man she saw in a white sedan. However, Rodney was never charged in the case as the police couldn't establish beyond a reasonable doubt that he was the perpetrator. After this significant setback, the case went cold once again. In November 2011, a confidential informant, who had been providing information to the Special Operations Group, became the new suspect. The individual, identified as Gerald Battistoni, attempted suicide while in prison after learning that he was considered a person of interest in Molly's case. Gerald also lived in the area where the teenager disappeared and had an extensive criminal record dating back to the 1980s. His DNA was analyzed in Texas, where he was serving his sentence, but the man passed away in November 2014 and was not charged with the crime. In June 2016, it was announced that enhanced DNA testing would be applied to 24 samples that had not yet been analyzed. A year later, in June 2017, investigators claimed to have found compelling information in the case. This information led them to a campground where the car allegedly used in Molly's abduction was supposedly buried. Multiple areas of interest were identified using ground-penetrating radar. The information was related to a new suspect who had lived at the campground around the time of Molly's abduction. At that time, he owned a white car similar to the one seen in the pond's parking lot. A witness stated that the man had told him something bad had happened and that he had been in the woods all night when Molly disappeared. He also reportedly had bloodshot scratches on his face. However, the man denied any involvement in the case, and it's unclear whether anything incriminating was found during the 2017 search. In 2019, new tests were conducted using more advanced technology in the hope of obtaining additional data to analyze the case's evidence. Investigators were hopeful that they could obtain a DNA profile with the new procedures, but the wheels of justice would once again turn slowly for Molly. On June 3, 2021, Worcester County District Attorney Joseph Early announced that Francis P. Sumner Sr. was a new person of interest in the case. According to reports at the time, it was not possible to arrest him because he had been found dead in his home 5 years earlier. However, the police received a verifiable lead that Francis was involved in Molly's disappearance. Because the investigation is still ongoing, authorities cannot provide many details about the case against Francis, but his criminal history is part of the reason he became a suspect. He had amassed a long list of crimes during his life and had served concurrent sentences for multiple abuses against women in the area where Molly worked. Police had received several tips about him over the years, and this time, the information given in the tips could be corroborated and verified. Francis had been convicted of kidnapping and raping a young woman who had gone to his auto repair shop in 1981. He was released on parole in 1998, just 2 years before Molly's disappearance. He lived not far from where Molly disappeared. He also resembled the composite sketch of the suspect. Unfortunately, he died in 2016 without facing charges in the case. Investigators continue to seek more information about him. When the existence of a new suspect was announced, the Bish family granted several interviews. Molly's older sister, Heather, told a media outlet that she believed investigators were doing everything possible with the information about the new suspect. As part of the effort to determine Francis's involvement, the police went to Ohio to obtain a DNA sample from his son, who was serving a federal prison sentence. This would enable them to conduct DNA analysis to establish a match with the deceased offender. Heather stated that someone like Francis, a convicted sex offender and rapist, should have been on the sex offender registry. This would have allowed them to approach him in the early stages of the investigation, and perhaps the case could have been closed with less trauma for everyone involved. In the same interview, Molly's sister pointed out that the conclusion of the investigation, which has spanned decades, would bring peace to her family. While they will always miss Molly, at least they won't have to keep trying to figure out who was responsible for her absence. Molly Bish's disappearance sparked the largest search for a missing person in the history of the state of Massachusetts. As of 2023, the case remains unresolved. The family believes they are nearing the end of the search for the culprit, although they are also aware that there is a very high likelihood that there may never be complete closure. Her killer has not yet been apprehended, but the case remains open, and the investigation is ongoing. A reward of $100,000 is still being offered for information leading to a definitive resolution. Molly's disappearance has turned her parents into staunch advocates for child safety. They hope that through their efforts, they can prevent other children from becoming victims of predators. Vilma Gabriela Niño de Guzmán de la Rosa was born in Peru in the late 1940s. She married José Tejada Ramirez, a man 21 years her senior. José had an older son from his first marriage. After they started living, he increasingly started distancing from his previous family, including his son. Vilma had a strong and reserved character. In contrast, she was a woman who reserved all her tenderness and dedication for the plants in her garden. Caring for them meticulously, talking to them and observing them daily was an activity that offered her unparalleled peace. When she finally felt the call of motherhood, it was not easy for her to fulfill her dream. José was over 70 years old while she had already passed her most fertile age. However, she was not one to give up easily. Thus, the couple decided to undergo fertility treatment. Finally, after a long struggle, at 49, Vilma received what she considered the best news of her life. She was pregnant. Later, when the couple learned they were expecting a girl, José felt tremendous joy. It seemed like a miracle, one he could never have imagined at his age. For her part, Vilma promised to be the best mother possible for the child. The little girl came into the world at the start of the new millennium, and they named her Stephanie. Healthy, rosy-cheeked, and cheerful, as the girl grew, she confirmed to her parents that the decision to have her had been the best. With her smile and vivacity, awakened in both a new energy and tenderness they had not known before. Over time, the girl proved to be very coquettish, feminine, and a fashion lover. Although the exact date is unknown, José suffered a stroke. While he survived, the aftermath was significant, as José was left disabled and was later diagnosed with senile dementia. Meanwhile, Vilma had to face raising her daughter alone. Her ambition was for Stephanie to become a righteous woman and, hopefully, a future doctor in medicine. However, as often happens, Stephanie's entry into puberty brought changes in her behavior. It was 2012 and suddenly, the once sweet and warm girl began showing signs of rebellion. As expected, this transformation also disrupted the mother-daughter relationship. Suddenly, that residence became the scene of constant confrontations that grew more frequent over time. Most of these fights occurred when Vilma forbade her daughter from going out with friends. For Stephanie, being locked up at home was tormenting, even perceiving it as a prison. In April of that same year, the young girl took an interest in another student from her high school named Fernando. He was a fairly calm boy, with many friends and no history of violence or rebellious behavior. When they met, it was love at first sight for him. Stephanie was not only a beautiful girl, but also confident and decisive. Thus, they quickly became a couple. At 15, Fernando felt on top of the world, capable of anything. But sometime later, everything changed. By the end of 2012, the relationship between the teenagers was tumultuous, as evidenced by a letter that Stephanie wrote to him. In her own handwriting, the young girl boasted of knowing her own charms perfectly, making it clear that if he didn't measure up, she could easily replace him with another boy. Although Vilma learned of her daughter's relationship, she initially tried not to interfere. After all, she believed it was likely just a fleeting, insignificant romance typical of Stephanie's age. But months passed with no sign of the affair ending. Meanwhile, Stephanie took control of the relationship, knowing how to dominate Fernando. She liked to give orders and, of course, to be obeyed. When this did not happen, she punished him, scratching him, justifying it by saying he well deserved it. Far from leaving her, or at least reacting, Fernando endured the situation, hopelessly in love, to the point of even setting aside his preferences, dignity, or social life. Because by then, the relationship also distanced him from his friends. Judging by some leaked text messages, the young man felt lost and, in essence, suffered greatly after each fight with his girlfriend. An example of this is an audio message Fernando sent to Stephanie at 2 a.m. on January 6, 2013. Besides showing how insecure he was regarding her feelings, Fernando said some quite worrying things, talking about ending someone's life and seeking his girlfriend's support for these ideas. Although it was not clear to whom Fernando was referring, it was true that around that time Stephanie had started flirting with other young men. And of course, in the school environment, the news quickly spread. Upon hearing the rumors, Vilma opposed the relationship between her daughter and Fernando. This became the cause of countless fights. Refusing to obey her mother, Stephanie continued to see Fernando in secret. On Saturday, January 11th, 2014, just before noon, the girl snuck her boyfriend into her house. They then went up to the second floor, to her room, where they locked themselves in to watch TV and later had an intimate encounter. When Fernando's father noticed his son's absence, suspecting he had returned to Stephanie, he began calling him on the phone. Distracted, or perhaps anticipating his father's reproaches, Fernando did not answer. However, his father was not willing to give up, so he went to Stephanie's house to look for him. Once there, the man's shouts made Vilma come out of her room on the first floor. Although she ignored him and did not open the door, she immediately understood what was happening. Filled with anger, Vilma went upstairs and, without a word, broke into the room where her teenage daughter was with her boyfriend. It was at that moment that a fight broke out between the three, but it was an unequal struggle, as Fernando soon managed to immobilize the woman. At that moment, Stephanie delivered a strong blow to her mother's head. The force was such that Vilma fell to the floor, dying. Immediately after, the teenager placed the body under her bed. Then Fernando and she went to the bathroom to clean themselves. At 90 years old and with senile dementia, Jose heard nothing and was unaware of anything. After that, Fernando went home. Later that same day, Stephanie kept in touch with dozens of people through her social media accounts. She confessed she felt that her heart was at peace and that her problems had finally ended, expressing the pleasurable feelings she was experiencing without specifying the reason. From that moment, Stephanie moved into her mother's room, which was about 10 meters away from hers. Additionally, she took the savings Vilma had, just over $10,000, and went on a shopping spree, spending as she pleased. 48 hours later, she posted a photo taken with her cell phone camera, in which she appeared wearing short floral pants and a pink blouse, holding a small puppy she had just bought in her right hand. She also paid for a change of style. As days passed, the teenager remained calm, even with her mother's decomposing body in the house. She continued to party with friends on several occasions. Jose, due to his health condition and advanced age, did not receive the care he needed from his daughter. When the smell from the second floor became unbearable, she and Fernando sprayed the room with various cleaning products and insecticides. They also partially covered the stained wall with black paint. Meanwhile, despite not being particularly friendly with them, the neighbors noticed that Vilma had not been seen watering the plants in her garden for a while. On January 16th, Stephanie called Fernando to tell him that 3 people were going to help her take out her mother's remains. According to his later testimony, Fernando suddenly felt a great repulsion towards his girlfriend, almost as if for the first time he fully understood what kind of person she was. He then decided to end their relationship. Although he no longer communicated with her or saw her, Stephanie tried to contact him in any way possible. Realizing that her text messages and calls were not being answered, the minor spoke with Marco, a cousin of Fernando's, and through him, she sent messages via one of her social media accounts. There, with encrypted messages, she asked him not to do anything foolish and not to say anything about what had happened. By that time, Vilma's loved ones had tried to contact her without success. Every time they asked Stephanie, she gave some excuse. After some time, they stopped believing her explanations and began to suspect that something had happened to her. In early March 2014, Vilma's relatives reported her strange disappearance to the authorities. Consequently, on the night of Sunday, March 9th of that year, the police arrived at the house with them. When they did not receive a satisfactory response from Stephanie about her mother's prolonged absence, the officers broke into the property with the family's authorization. Once inside, they found Stephanie nervously giving them the runaround in an attempt to hinder the authorities' progress. But the young woman's efforts were in vain, as the strong smell and the flies buzzing all over the place only heightened the police's worst fears. Upon turning the key to the room, the macabre scene was revealed in a matter of seconds. For 57 days, Vilma's body had been there, in the room of the daughter. Forensic experts at the scene found a knife, which was taken for analysis to determine if it had been used to kill Vilma. The authorities immediately considered Stephanie the main suspect in the crime. However, in her version of events, she tried to absolve herself of any responsibility and accused Fernando. Within minutes, reporters swarmed the surroundings of the house. The head of the Criminal Investigation Division informed the press of what was known so far, based on the minor's statements. Thus, both the motive and the cause of Vilma's death were still under investigation. The 65-year-old woman's body was transferred for forensic examinations. Meanwhile, news cameras managed to enter the house and obtained images of the teenager's room. There, marks on the floor were still visible, despite the presence of several bottles of different elements, presumably used to erase them. It wasn't until the following day, Monday, March 10th, 2014, that the police formalized the request to initiate a process for violation of criminal law for the crimes committed by the 14-year-old minor. Consequently, Stephanie was forced to remain in a juvenile center for the duration of the process. In the early hours of Tuesday, amidst the tumult of reporters and neighbors, agents transferred Stephanie as some of those present shouted accusations at her. Due to her status as a minor, she wore her face semi-hidden with a cap. Nevertheless, she took advantage of the cameras and microphones to defend herself. During the police interrogation, Stephanie added more details to her version of events. This time, she said that her mother became enraged upon discovering her with her boyfriend and then hit her with an iron bar. At that moment, Fernando came to her defense and attacked Vilma, injuring her in the left eye. They struggled, and then he pulled out a knife. She took the blade from him and tried to attack him, but he crawled away and with another blunt object hit Vilma 3 more times in the head. The story continued with Stephanie going to the bathroom to clean the wound her own mother had inflicted on her. By that time, Vilma was already showing no signs of life, and Fernando also approached the sink to wash off the traces of the crime they had just committed. In conclusion, Stephanie only admitted to hiding the body. A few hours later, after being summoned by the authorities, Fernando appeared at the police station to give his testimony. He arrived accompanied by his father and his lawyer. The detectives heard from the young man that all responsibility for the crime lay exclusively with Stephanie. Furthermore, Fernando claimed that the girl was tired of the constant physical abuse she suffered at the hands of her mother. The boy recounted that the teenager used the same bar with which her mom had hit her several times. However, Fernando's version did not convince the police either, as he made serious contradictions during the interrogation. Consequently, the police decided that the young man should be held as the suspected co-author and accomplice of the homicide. It was up to the prosecution to decide whether to charge him. On the afternoon of March 12th, 60 days after the crime, Vilma's body was removed from the morgue and was taken directly to the cemetery, where she was buried in the presence of family and friends. One of the victim's nieces called for the maximum penalty for the 2 minors involved, adding that for teenagers, it seemed all too easy to kill without facing responsibilities. She also mentioned that Stephanie was very much loved by her mother and denied there was a bad relationship between them. Meanwhile, the prosecution's decision led to Fernando's arrest. The teenager was placed in a juvenile center. Experts concluded that he was a young man with a tendency towards introversion, easily influenced by a figure that generated emotional attachment. They also indicated that Fernando submitted to his partner's wishes, allowing himself to be manipulated to satisfy her desires, showing himself submissive and compliant out of fear of emotional abandonment. Regarding Stephanie, forensic psychologists saw that the young woman had psychopathological traits in her personality. Amidst the twists and turns of the case, a television report revealed that Stephanie had been influenced by another girl who was in prison for killing her mother after a heated argument on March 5, 2005. It was also stated that Stephanie stored poems of her on a tablet or personal computer. At the end of March that same year, Stephanie insisted on her innocence through a letter. There, she explained that when she misbehaved and did not obey her mother, she was hit with a towel or a notebook, but not with an iron bar. An unexpected twist was her portrayal of Fernando, whom she accused of mistreatment and threats, even against his father. The reason was simple. He was obsessed with her and aimed to socially isolate her. Lastly, she assured that she loved and respected her mother and was overwhelmed with sadness from missing her father so much. In this story, Jose too was a victim of circumstances, even though he was unaware of what was happening around him. The elderly man was left at the mercy of Vilma's family. When the firstborn finally learned of the crime and traveled from Brazil, he found that Vilma's family refused to let him see his own father. After turning to the authorities, Jose's son was finally able to rescue him. He found his father in a state of neglect and uncleanliness, and they were unable to find his documents anywhere in the house. Consequently, his lawyer reiterated his request for the relevant agency to expedite the delivery of this documentation. Without it, neither Jose nor his son could claim his pension. The entire country remained attentive to any new detail, even those concerning the daily life of the main suspect. Once transferred to a new center, Stephanie made headlines again when it was revealed that she shared a third-year classroom with another minor accused of a similar crime, Rosalinda. Her case was also highly publicized in Peru. The young girl, who had suffered excessive abuse at the hands of her mother, retaliated against her and took her life. The director of the juvenile center told a Peruvian TV program that the two girls had no problems adapting to the group and also showed acceptable performance. According to her, as part of her job, it was not her place to judge them. Instead, it was necessary to do everything possible as a system to reintegrate them into society. The young women could be confined there until they turned 20, as Peruvian law only imposes a maximum of 6 years of readaptation in juvenile centers for crimes committed by minors. For adults, the country's legislation imposes up to 35 years of effective imprisonment for those responsible for these crimes. On the night of Thursday, April 10, 2014, the crime reconstruction took place. During this, the young woman smiled, made victory gestures, and showed no remorse. Fernando also participated, but, unlike Stephanie, chose not to speak to the press and preferred to hide his face, wearing a bulletproof vest at all times. Both arrived from their respective juvenile centers and had no contact with each other during the procedure. However, coldly and without showing regret, they attacked and accused each other. Upon leaving the scene, Stephanie began to play with her hair as the cameras from photographers and television stations focused on her. Meanwhile, Fernando's defense argued that the accusation against their client was full of contradictions. The psychological assessment of the crime scene, conducted by experts, found evidence of cruelty, planning, and simulation of the events, including the use of air fresheners and wall paint to hide blood traces. Days later, Jose visited his daughter for the first time. Still coming to terms with the events and remembering little, he hoped Stephanie would tell him everything. After leaving, following a 2-hour visit, he mentioned that his daughter blamed her former boyfriend for the crime, insisting to him that she was incapable of such evil. Jose carried with him a gift from his daughter, a pink heart saying she loved him. In the second half of April 2014, Stephanie's situation worsened when investigations into her cell phone uncovered threatening messages she had sent Fernando. These texts were retrieved by the young man's family for use in court, aiming to prove that Stephanie had planned the crime. By the end of July 2014, the prosecution formally charged Stephanie as the perpetrator of her mother's murder, with Fernando deemed an accomplice to the crime. In both cases, the public ministry requested 6 years of detention in a juvenile center and a compensation payment of $1,300. The prosecution's conclusions were based on the autopsy report, psychological assessments, and the crime scene psychological appraisal. Exclusive footage of Fernando in court was captured by a television camera. Walter, Fernando's father, was outraged by the verdict, insisting that there was no evidence incriminating his son. He believed that the inability to absolve Stephanie led to Fernando being charged as an accomplice. Contrary to the father's hopes, in October 2014, Fernando was sentenced to 4 years and 6 months in prison, while Stephanie received a 6-year sentence. After serving their sentences, Stephanie and Fernando were released, with no further updates on their lives made public. Yet, in Peru, the memory of this shocking story lingers, a story of a daughter whose miraculous birth filled her parents with joy, only to later become a figure far from the angel they had dreamt of spending their final years with. Felicia Johnson was the eldest of 3 children. After her parents' divorce, she and her siblings remained under the care of their father, Kevin. Struggling to manage the teenagers on his own, Kevin soon remarried a woman named Myra. Felicia, resembling her paternal grandmother both in looks and personality, was sweet, kind, and always smiling. From a young age, Felicia matured quickly. Her feminine figure attracted attention during her teenage years, and as she grew older, she realized she could potentially profit from her looks. Social media became her platform to showcase herself, and she meticulously maintained her appearance, always ensuring her face, hair, and body were picture perfect. She dreamt of a glamorous life and tried to embody the current beauty trends: long, wavy hair, defined eyebrows, and fluttery lashes. Felicia loved to dance and aspired to become a model. Despite many setbacks in the highly competitive industry, she never gave up, consistently applying to various modeling agencies in hopes of making it big. Living with her family in San Diego, California, Felicia had recently turned 24 and decided to celebrate by taking a trip to Houston, Texas. Excited for this new adventure, she planned every detail of her getaway, from getting her nails done to packing her outfits in advance. She even considered staying longer in Houston if she could find work there, full of dreams and optimism about the journey ahead. However, what was supposed to be a fun and exciting trip took a dark turn. Felicia's life tragically came to an end during what should have been a celebratory time. She had been in constant communication with her loved ones, keeping them updated on her experiences and impressions of the city. But on April 15th, 2022, Felicia abruptly stopped responding to calls and messages. Her presence on social media, once consistent and vibrant, suddenly vanished. Concern quickly turned into panic when her family and friends realized something was wrong. Her disappearance was so alarming that the family took immediate action, hiring a private investigator to track down her last known location. The search led to Bear Creek Pioneers Park, a wooded area in Houston, just a few miles from where Felicia was last seen. There, her blood-stained phone was discovered on the roadside, a chilling sign that something terrible had happened. Back in San Diego, Kevin, Felicia's father, couldn't sit idly by. He immediately flew to Houston, determined to find his daughter. Upon arrival, he filed a missing person report with the police, but in his view, they were slow to act. It seemed that Felicia's case was not treated with the urgency it deserved, possibly due to her race. Still, Kevin refused to give up. Flyers with Felicia's photos and a detailed description were plastered across Bear Creek Pioneers Park, with local residents and visitors joining the search. The search expanded, even attracting the attention of the FBI after Quenelle X, a community activist, highlighted the alarming number of missing dark-skinned girls in Houston over recent months. Many feared that Felicia might become another victim in a series of unsolved disappearances. Despite the increased efforts, the only other piece of evidence found was Felicia's purse. In an effort to piece together her final movements, detectives spoke with her friends and family. They discovered that, while in Houston, Felicia had applied for a job at an adult entertainment club called Cover Girls. Unfortunately, she was rejected. After leaving the club, Felicia had ordered a taxi back to her hotel, but that's where the trail went cold. This lead, however, offered hope that her last steps could be retraced, bringing her family and the authorities closer to uncovering the truth about what really happened to Felicia Johnson. The Johnson family, with the support of social activist Quenelle X, believed that Felicia's disappearance was somehow tied to the nightclub where she had applied for work. Kevin Johnson, Felicia's father, suspected that his daughter might have been caught in a human trafficking operation where women from out of town were forced into the sex trade. Although he had no concrete evidence, Kevin held on to the hope that Felicia was alive and in a difficult situation from which she couldn't escape on her own. He vowed to find her at any cost. Detectives shared a similar theory, suspecting Felicia had been abducted and was being held against her will. They hoped to find her alive and, believing she might be in a place with access to media, urged Kevin to make a public statement. His emotional message, broadcast on TV, was a way to both comfort Felicia, encouraging her to stay strong and to appeal to the public for information. Kevin reassured his daughter that her family loved her deeply and was praying for her safe return, promising that he wouldn't stop searching until she was home. He also addressed her potential captors, warning them that the family would never give up and that he would personally hunt down whoever was responsible. Kevin and his family felt increasingly frustrated with law enforcement, believing that the police were not doing enough. Key developments in the investigation, such as the discovery of Felicia's phone and purse, had been made by a private investigator and volunteers rather than by the police. Even Kevin's public appeal to find his daughter had been made without the direct involvement of the Houston Police Department, which only heightened the family's concerns. 2 weeks after Felicia's disappearance, her family, friends, and supporters gathered outside the city administration in a bid to draw the mayor's attention to her case and the perceived lack of urgency in the investigation. Kevin had many questions for the police, but no answers. One critical point of frustration was the surveillance footage from the nightclub where Felicia had last been seen. Despite the availability of cameras, it seemed that detectives either hadn't requested the footage or were reluctant to share it with the family. Although it's unclear if the demonstration reached Houston's mayor, it did capture the attention of Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who stepped in to ensure the police took the case seriously. She promised to help the family obtain any existing surveillance footage, vowing that the city owed Felicia protection as a visitor. The nightclub in question, Cover Girls, initially claimed not to remember whether Felicia had ever come in for an interview, and there was no formal record of her visit. Eventually, the club handed over internal surveillance footage, which confirmed that Felicia had indeed inquired about a job, but had been turned away. After leaving, she had called for a taxi and waited outside. Her friends who had been messaging her that day corroborated this account, and the recordings provided no new information. The family's suspicion of the club's involvement stemmed from poor communication between the authorities and Kevin, who wasn't being kept in the loop about the investigation's progress. After leaving the nightclub, Felicia returned to her hotel near the Houston Medical Center around 3 a.m. on April 16th. It was the last confirmed sighting of her. Investigators later discovered that after failing to secure the nightclub job, Felicia had called for a taxi, but the car was delayed. An unknown man then offered her a ride, which she eventually accepted. This man was later identified as Chukwuebuka Neibaldo, a 28-year-old man of Nigerian descent who had lived in Houston most of his life. He and Felicia exchanged contact information and continued to communicate on Snapchat, where they arranged to meet again the following morning. Their conversation revealed that Chukwuebuka had offered Felicia $500 in exchange for intimate services, to which she agreed. After that, no one saw Felicia again. Her phone went silent, her social media stopped, and no further transactions were made on her credit cards. She had seemingly vanished without a trace. The police investigation soon revealed that Chukwuebuka had ordered a taxi for Felicia, which took her to a residential complex on Windchase Boulevard. Later, Chukwuebuka drove Felicia in his car to his apartment on South Richmond Avenue. An hour later, his vehicle was seen leaving the apartment complex, and around the same time, Felicia's phone last pinged near Bear Creek Park, where it was later found. Detectives believe that Chukwuebuka had murdered Felicia in his apartment, disposed of her phone and purse in the park, and possibly dismembered her body to hide the remains. Surveillance footage from a nearby home goods store showed Chukwuebuka purchasing suspicious items the day after Felicia's disappearance, including garbage bags, gloves, a shovel, and an electric kitchen saw. His right hand was bandaged in the video, suggesting he may have been injured during the attack. On May 13, 2022, police arrested Chukwuebuka for a minor traffic violation, but released him after a brief interrogation. They had found latex gloves, a shovel, and cleaning supplies in his car, along with dried bloodstains in the trunk. Despite this, they claimed there wasn't enough evidence to charge him with Felicia's murder at that time. While searching his apartment, authorities discovered bloodstains on the floor and in the hallway. DNA tests confirmed that the blood belonged to Felicia. The amount of blood made it clear that she couldn't have survived. Additionally, Chukwuebuka's phone revealed disturbing internet searches related to becoming a serial killer and disposing of bodies, as well as graphic images of deceased women. Though Felicia's body was never found, the police were certain that she had been killed. This devastating news was nearly unbearable for Kevin, who had held on to hope that his daughter was still alive. He continued to fight for justice. Though the investigation's slow progress and the initial lack of police action left him disheartened, Chukwuebuka, meanwhile, vanished after his release, leaving the case without closure. Though there was no direct confirmation that the disturbing photos found on Chukwuebuka's phone were of Felicia Johnson, the condition in which her remains were later discovered made it difficult to rule out the possibility. The women in the photos remained unidentified, with no metadata attached to the images to help detectives trace their origins. However, during the investigation, authorities uncovered a previous harassment case involving Chukwuebuka. A few years earlier, a woman had accused him of attempting to force her into sexual acts while inside his car. The woman had managed to escape by resisting and running away, leaving her attacker behind. Although she initially reported the incident to the police, she later retracted her statement and refused to cooperate further. It was unclear why she changed her story, but the case was dropped. This incident, however, highlighted Chukwuebuka's past violent behavior toward women, raising serious concerns as he became the prime suspect in Felicia's case. The blood found in Chukwuebuka's apartment, along with the dismembered body photos on his phone, pointed to his involvement in Felicia's death. Tragically, by the time these pieces of evidence were discovered, Chukwuebuka had already been released by the authorities. If the investigation had been more coordinated, he would likely have been behind bars. Realizing their mistake, law enforcement quickly filed charges against Chukwuebuka in June 2022, accusing him of Felicia Johnson's murder and tampering with evidence. Unfortunately, he had already disappeared by then. The formal charges marked progress in the investigation, but shattered the Johnson family's hope of finding Felicia alive. They had clung to the belief that she might have been in a terrible situation but could still be rescued. The Johnson family, desperate for answers, offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to Chukwuebuka's arrest. Vigils were held in both San Diego and Bear Creek Park, where Felicia's phone had been found. Friends and loved ones gathered to remember the vibrant and witty young woman they had lost, hoping that her body would soon be recovered and laid to rest properly. For a year, the Johnson family lived in a painful limbo, not knowing where Felicia's remains were or what had happened to her. Finally, in February 2023, skeletal remains were found in Sam Houston National Forest, prompting detectives to believe they had found Felicia. While they waited for dental record confirmation, Kevin Johnson was informed that the remains likely belonged to his daughter. The police's certainty came from the location, the condition of the remains, and some personal items found with the body. For Kevin, this discovery, though heartbreaking, brought some closure. It was agonizing to wake up every day knowing his daughter wasn't alive, but even more unbearable was the thought that she hadn't been given a proper burial. Now, he could finally bring her home. The discovery of a body in the forest shocked the local community. The area, though wooded, was near residential homes, and the sight of forensic teams and police vehicles signaled that something terrible had occurred. People who regularly walked through the forest were horrified to learn that, just a few feet away, the remains of a girl who had been missing for a year had been hidden. Forensic examination confirmed that the remains belonged to Felicia, identified through dental records. However, only the upper portion of her torso was found, making it impossible to determine the exact cause of death. The rest of her body remained missing, leaving unanswered questions about what had happened and whether the remaining parts would ever be found. Despite these uncertainties, the discovery gave the Johnson family some peace. Kevin Johnson made a public statement expressing relief that his daughter had finally come home to seek justice. He vowed to continue fighting for answers and justice, not only for Felicia, but also for other victims who had suffered at the hands of criminals like Chukwuebuka. Though physically and emotionally drained from months of anguish, Kevin remained steadfast in his pursuit of justice. Even with the discovery of Felicia's remains, Chukwuebuka was still at large. Law enforcement suspected he had committed other violent crimes and was potentially a threat to more women. Over the past year, Kevin had struggled with depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, unable to sleep or come to terms with the reality of what had happened to his daughter. In a devastating reality, Chukwuebuka remains on the run to this day. He is considered extremely dangerous, and there is fear that he may have harmed other women. The Johnson family continues to raise awareness, urging the public to stay vigilant and share Felicia's story in the hope that justice will finally be served. Kevin and his family also dream of creating a foundation in Felicia's honor, dedicated to helping women forced into exploitative situations. For the Johnsons, Felicia wasn't just a 24-year-old woman with dreams. She was a daughter, a sister, and a friend whose life mattered. They want to ensure that her legacy will help protect other women, giving them the compassion and dignity every person deserves.